Hey guys, tonight we're taking a rather bracing and perhaps slightly alarming plunge into the stark, disciplined, and legendarily peculiar world of ancient Sparta. Imagine yourself not in your usual comfortable surroundings, but standing in the rugged, sun-baked valley of the Eurotas River in Laconia, surrounded by formidable mountains and even more formidable, highly laconic warriors. We're here to unravel a particularly curious thread in their social fabric, their very strange and often misunderstood customs surrounding marriage, including a rather dramatic ritual often described as marriage by capture. Now picture this, you're trying to get married in ancient Sparta. If you're a young man, this probably involves successfully surviving years of the notoriously brutal Agoge military training, being able to subsist on famously unappetizing black broth, and generally being a paragon of warrior virtue. If you're a young woman, it means being physically fit, educated by ancient Greek standards at least, and cheerfully prepared to be captured by your future husband in a bizarre, carefully orchestrated nighttime ritual that seems more like a friendly kidnapping than a romantic proposal. Your chances of a conventional courtship involving candlelit dinners, gentle poetry recitations, and a polite asking of your father's hand would be, let's just say, approximately zero. Sparta, as you're about to discover, did things very differently. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And as always, I'd love to know where you're tuning in from tonight. Drop your location and local time in the comments below. It's always fascinating to see our sleepy historical community. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself at Egeria, transported to the Peloponnesian Peninsula of ancient Greece, specifically to the region of Laconia, a land of stark, often breathtaking beauty. Towering, rugged mountain ranges like Taygetus and Parnon frame a fertile, if somewhat narrow, river valley through which the Eurotas River flows, making its way south to the Laconian Gulf. This is not the gentle, sun-dappled landscape of Athenian olive groves or the idyllic islands of the Aegean. This is a sterner, more austere land one that seems to breed a certain toughness, a resilience in its inhabitants. And at its heart, not a grand walled metropolis filled with marble temples and bustling agoras in the style of Athens or Corinth, but a rather more unassuming collection of villages spread across the plain lay the powerful, enigmatic, and often feared city-state of Lacedaemon, more commonly known to history as Sparta. A mainstream historical fact is that ancient Sparta was one of the most prominent and influential Doric Greek city-states, renowned above all for its unique socio-political system. Its disciplined hoplite warriors who formed the backbone of arguably the finest army in Greece for centuries, and its often starkly different, deeply conservative customs compared to other Greek poleis, particularly its great rival Athens. Sparta was a society that prioritized the collective over the individual military readiness above all else, and an almost fanatical devotion to discipline, obedience, and an austere, unluxurious way of life. Welcome to Sparta. We sincerely hope you enjoy your imaginary stay. Your complimentary luxury welcome package includes one slightly scratchy but eminently practical crimson woolen cloak. Phoinikis, a daily nourishing bowl of famously unappetizing black broth, the precise contents of which were an official state secret. But unofficially between you and me probably involved pork salt vinegar and a considerable amount of pig's blood. Best not to ask too many questions, just try to think of it as an acquired taste, like very, very acquired. And the thrilling daily opportunity to engage in some light character-building spear practice before your meager breakfast. Enjoy your visit. Now it's important to acknowledge from the outset what historians call the Spartan Mirage. Much of what we think we know about Sparta comes not from the Spartans themselves, who were notoriously laconic and left very few written records of their own customs, but from outside observers. Primarily Athenian writers like Xenophon and Plato, who sometimes idealize certain aspects of Spartan discipline. Later Greek historians and biographers like Plutarch, writing centuries after Sparta's classical heyday, but drawing on earlier sources and various Roman authors. These external accounts are often colored by their own biases, whether admiration for Sparta's stability and military prowess, or criticism of its perceived harshness, insularity, and social rigidity. This means that the popular image of Sparta as a perfectly ordered, unchanging, purely militaristic society, a kind of ancient warrior utopia or dystopia, depending on your perspective, is partly a construct, an idealized or sometimes demonized reflection. The extent to which the highly formalized and often rather severe picture of Spartan life presented in these later, mostly non-Spartan, literary sources accurately reflects the nuanced, lived reality of Spartan society across its many centuries of existence versus being a somewhat romanticized or critically exaggerated mirage, remains a subject of intense and ongoing debate among ancient historians and classical scholars. Nevertheless, even allowing for this mirage, Sparta was undeniably unique, a society that deliberately organized itself around a set of laws and institutions attributed to a semi-legendary lawgiver named Lycurgus. These Lycurgan reforms, supposedly instituted way back in the mists of the Archaic period, were designed to create eunomia, good order, good government, by instilling in all Spartan citizens a profound sense of duty, discipline, obedience to the law, and an absolute commitment to the welfare and security of the state above all personal considerations. The social structure of Sparta was also highly unusual. At the top were the Spartiates, the full citizens and elite warrior class who were forbidden from engaging in agriculture or trade, dedicating their entire lives to military training and service to the state. Below them were the Perioikoi, dwellers around free non-citizens who lived in the surrounding towns and villages of Laconia and Messenia. They were farmers, craftsmen, and merchants, and they served in the Spartan army, but they lacked the political rights of Spartiates. And at the very bottom, forming the vast majority of the population and the absolute bedrock of the Spartan economy, were the Helots. The Helots were a subjugated, state-owned serf population, primarily the conquered Messenians, who were forced to till the land and provide agricultural produce for their Spartan masters. They lived under constant surveillance and brutal repression, and the ever-present fear of a Helot revolt was a major factor shaping Sparta's militaristic and inward-looking nature. Spartan social life was efficient, shall we say. Less time was dedicated to idle chatter, philosophical debates in the agora, or the frivolous composition of lyric poetry, though early Sparta did have a tradition of choral song and dance. More time was devoted to rigorous physical training, synchronized phalanx drills, and the cultivation of a deeply meaningful, if somewhat monosyllabic, stoicism. If you wanted a wild, intellectually stimulating party with lots of witty banter and perhaps a symposium that went on until dawn, you probably went to Athens or Corinth. If, however, you wanted to be reasonably confident that you could, if necessary, snap a wild boar's neck with your bare hands by the age of 12 and endure extreme hardship without complaint, Sparta was most definitely your place. It is within this stark, disciplined, and uniquely structured world-ageria that the Spartans developed their equally unique customs surrounding life-love, and most pertinent to our sleepy exploration marriage. Given the state's overwhelming emphasis on producing strong, healthy, and utterly loyal citizens to serve as future warriors and mothers of warriors, it's hardly surprising that marriage in Sparta was viewed not primarily as a private matter of personal affection or romantic choice, but as a profound civic duty, a crucial mechanism for ensuring the continued strength and survival of the Spartan state. And the rituals surrounding this duty, as you will soon discover, were every bit as peculiar, as focused, and as strangely Spartan as everything else in their remarkable and often rather intimidating world. The very idea of a strangely forbidden journey east that we explored with the Roman Egeria would be unthinkable for a Spartan woman. Her journey was to be within the bounds of Laconia, her primary duty to the state, and her path to wedlock a very particular and very Spartan adventure indeed. You have now stepped Egeria into the stark, sun-drenched, and rather intimidating valley of the Eurotas River, the heartland of ancient Lacedaemon, or Sparta as it's more famously known. You've glimpsed the austere, disciplined, and fiercely militaristic society that flourished here, a community that deliberately set itself apart from the rest of the Greek world with its unique laws attributed to the legendary Lycurgus, its rejection of luxury, and its all-consuming focus on the strength and security of the state. We've established that marriage in this peculiar polis was primarily a civic duty aimed at producing the next generation of robust Spartan warriors and equally robust Spartan mothers. But before we delve into the rather startling and unconventional rituals of Spartan courtship and wedding ceremonies themselves, it's crucial to understand the young women who were at the heart of these unions. For Spartan girls, unlike their counterparts in most other Greek city-states, particularly Athens, were raised in a surprisingly robust, educated, and relatively liberated manner, all with one primary goal in mind: to become strong, healthy mothers of strong, healthy Spartan citizens. A mainstream historical fact, and one that often shocked and fascinated other Greeks, is that Spartan girls received a state-supervised upbringing that included a significant emphasis on physical education alongside instruction in music, dance, and literacy. This was almost revolutionary in a Greek world where most girls, especially in a city like Athens, were largely confined to the gynoeceum. The women's quarters of the house received minimal formal education beyond domestic skills and were expected to live quiet, secluded lives, rarely seen or heard in public. While Athenian girls were perhaps diligently learning to weave very demure and intricate patterns in the shadowy corners of their homes, their Spartan contemporaries were out in the sunshine, running races, wrestling, throwing the javelin and discus, and generally engaging in vigorous physical training. You absolutely would not want to get into an impromptu arm wrestling contest with a Spartan maiden after she'd just completed her daily regimen of sprinting and spear chucking. She'd likely rearrange your entire skeletal structure with a cheerful, characteristically laconic remark about your clearly deficient upper body strength. Why this extraordinary emphasis on female physicality? The Spartan logic, as articulated by ancient writers like Xenophon and Plutarch, was brutally pragmatic and eugenically driven. Strong, healthy, well-nourished women would produce strong, healthy, vigorous children. And strong, healthy, vigorous children, especially boys, were the absolute bedrock of Sparta's military might, and its very survival as a state constantly facing the potential threat of a Helot uprising or rival Greek powers. The Spartan state therefore took a keen interest in the physical fitness of its future mothers. Lycurgus, their revered lawgiver, was said to have prescribed these exercises for girls precisely so that the mothers of their children might be more robust and that they might better be able to endure the pains of childbearing. So imagine yourself, Egeria, as a young Spartan girl. Your childhood is not one of delicate indoor pastimes and sheltered seclusion. You are encouraged to be outdoors, to be active, to build your strength and stamina. You would participate in athletic contests, sometimes even competing nude, or in short, practical tunics, just as the boys did a practice that caused considerable scandal and raised more than a few disapproving eyebrows among other more traditionally modest Greeks. A visiting Corinthian merchant, perhaps catching an unexpected glimpse of a group of Spartan girls energetically engaged in a public foot race or a rather boisterous wrestling match, might gasp-fan himself vigorously with his travel-worn cloak and mutter, "Goodness me, by Zeus and all the gods!" Those Spartan lasses are remarkably well aerated and surprisingly, almost alarmingly proficient at the standing long jump. Most irregular. Where is their chaperoning duenna with a large fan and some smelling salts? But it wasn't all just physical training. Spartan girls also received an education in what the Greeks called musike, which encompassed not just music, but also poetry, song, and dance. Choral performances were a significant part of Spartan religious festivals and civic life, and girls played a prominent role in these learning complex songs and intricate dances that celebrated Spartan heroes' gods and communal values. They were likely literate, taught to read and write, and would have been steeped in Spartan traditions, history, and the moral tales that reinforced their unique societal ethos of discipline, courage, and unwavering loyalty to the state. The exact nature and formal extent of this state-sponsored education for Spartan girls particularly, whether it constituted a highly structured parallel agoge-like system, directly analogous to that of the boys, or if it was a more informal but still culturally mandated set of customary training practices and educational expectations, is a subject of ongoing scholarly discussion and interpretation. As the surviving ancient sources, while emphasizing female physical training and some cultural education, are often less detailed about the specific curriculum or institutional framework for girls compared to their exhaustive descriptions of the male agoge. This robust upbringing, both physical and cultural, contributed to the famously distinctive character of Spartan women. They were renowned throughout the Greek world for their confidence, their outspokenness, their sharp wit, and their perceived lack of conventional feminine modesty, at least by Athenian standards. They had a degree of freedom of movement and social participation that was unparalleled for women in most other Greek city-states. They could inherit and own property, including land, A quirky or fringe tidbit is that Spartan women were famously, or perhaps infamously, from the perspective of some patriarchal Greek men, allowed to inherit and manage property to a degree almost unheard of elsewhere. By some later classical estimates, Spartan women eventually came to control a very significant portion, perhaps as much as a third to two-fifths of all Spartan land, giving them considerable, if indirect, economic and social clout. Spartan women were known for their often rather sharp, witty, and impressively concise, laconic, of course, remarks. If a Spartan woman observing your new, rather flamboyant Athenian-style tunic dryly remarked that it looked a bit much, you didn't launch into a lengthy defense of your fashion choices. You just quietly went home, rethought all your life decisions, and possibly burned the offending garment, perhaps while weeping softly into your daily ration of slightly too crunchy black broth. The primary purpose of this unique upbringing, however, always circled back to their future role as mothers. They were raised to be strong in body and spirit, not for their own personal liberation in a modern sense, but to be fit vessels for producing the next generation of Spartan warriors and capable mothers of more warriors. They typically married later than girls in other Greek cities, often in their late teens or early 20s rather than early to mid-teens, as was common in Athens. This too was believed to be conducive to healthier pregnancies and more robust offspring. So, as you, Egeria, prepare to witness the peculiar rituals of Spartan marriage, remember that the Spartan bride is not a delicate, sheltered flower. She is a product of a unique system, a woman of strength, education of a Spartan kind, and a certain indomitable spirit. She is not merely a passive pawn in a familial alliance. She is an active and vital contributor to the very survival and strength of the Spartan state, her body and her will forged for the sacred duty of motherhood. And this understanding of the Spartan woman is absolutely crucial to making any sense at all of the rather startling marriage by capture that awaits her. You now have a vivid picture, Egeria, of the remarkable young women of ancient Sparta. Physically robust, educated in their own distinct way, outspoken, and imbued with a profound sense of duty to the state primarily through their future role as mothers of strong Spartan warriors. They were by ancient Greek standards unusually free and formidable. But to understand the peculiar path to wedlock that awaited them, particularly that rather startling ritual often described as marriage by capture, we must now turn our sleepy attention to the other half of the equation, the Spartan man. For his upbringing, his entire life experience from early childhood was even more rigidly controlled, more intensely focused on the needs of the state, and arguably far more brutal than that of his female counterparts. You are about to follow a young Spartan boy as he enters the crucible of the agoge, the infamous state-sponsored training regimen designed to forge him into an unbreakable instrument of Spartan military might. A mainstream historical fact and perhaps the most defining characteristic of Spartan society was the agoge. This was the rigorous communal and mandatory education and training system imposed upon all male Spartiate citizens, the full Spartan peers from the tender age of 7, until they reached adulthood typically around the age of 20, though their military service and communal living continued long after. The agoge was not just a school, it was an all-encompassing way of life designed with a singular, unwavering purpose to produce the most disciplined, physically tough, obedient, resourceful, and utterly loyal hoplite warriors in the entire Greek world. The Spartan state, you see, wasn't overly concerned with nurturing well-rounded individuals with a penchant for philosophical debate or a talent for composing heartfelt lyric poetry, though as we noted, early Sparta did have its poets and musicians. Their primary export, their unique selling proposition, was unparalleled military excellence, and the agoge was the relentless, unforgiving assembly line that produced it. The Spartan agoge wasn't your typical friendly neighborhood after-school club. Okay, class, settle down, settle down. Today's exciting lesson plan includes advanced spear fighting techniques until your arms feel like they're about to fall off, followed by a rather bracing pop quiz on enduring significant levels of physical discomfort without whimpering or, heaven forbid, actually shedding a tear. And for homework tonight, class, please compose a very short, exceptionally stoic, and suitably patriotic poem about the undying glory of Sparta. Extra credit will be awarded if you can also successfully steal your bunkmate's meager dinner ration without getting caught, but only if you're really sneaky and resourceful about it. Dismissed. The journey began for a Spartan boy almost at birth. Infants were reputedly inspected by a council of elders, and if a child was deemed weak, sickly, or deformed, it was said to be exposed on the slopes of Mount Tegatus to die. A harsh eugenic practice designed to ensure that only the physically fit survived to become citizens. While the exact details and consistent application of this practice of infant exposure, particularly whether it was as systematic or as brutal as some later sources portray, or if it was perhaps exaggerated to emphasize Spartan toughness, are subjects of ongoing critical examination and debate among ancient historians. The underlying principle of valuing physical robustness from the very outset is clear. Assuming a boy passed this initial, rather terrifying quality control check, he would spend his first 7 years with his mother. But at age 7, his childhood effectively ended. He was removed from his family home and enrolled in the Agai, where he would live communally in barracks with other boys of his age group, known as an agel or herd. Life in these barracks was deliberately harsh, designed to strip away individual softness and instill unwavering obedience, endurance, and group loyalty. The conditions were minimalist to an extreme. Boys were given only one rough woolen cloak-hemation per year to be worn in all weathers. They slept on hard beds made of reeds which they themselves had to gather from the banks of the Eurotas River without knives. Their food rations were famously scant and unappetizing, the notorious black broth melis zomos being the staple. Food in the Agoge was so famously uninspiring and deliberately insufficient. It's like they were on a permanent future warrior, intermittent fasting, and advanced palate toughening diet. You didn't politely ask for seconds on the black broth. You more likely asked for a second helping of how to possibly survive until tomorrow on sheer, unadulterated willpower and the occasional illicitly pilfered and probably quite raw turnip snatched from a nearby heelet farm. This deliberate underfeeding was intended not just to accustom them to hardship, but also to encourage cunning resourcefulness and, yes, even theft to supplement their diet, though being caught stealing clumsily resulted in severe punishment, not for the theft itself but for the lack of skill in executing it. Discipline was iron-fisted and often brutal. Flogging was a common punishment for any infraction and sometimes even administered as a test of endurance, a way to cultivate pain tolerance and stoicism. Older boys and young men who acted as a kind of prefect system were responsible for training and disciplining the younger ones, often with a heavy hand. The entire system was designed to break down individual will and remold it into an unquestioning instrument of the Spartan state. Physical training was, of course, relentless. Running, jumping, wrestling, discus, and javelin throwing, and endless drills in military formations, particularly the hoplite phalanx, filled their days. They were taught to endure extremes of heat and cold, hunger and thirst, pain and fatigue, all without complaint. A particularly quirky or fringe tidbit, and one that highlights the Spartan obsession with endurance, was the notorious ritual at the altar of Artemis Orthia. Here, as part of a religious festival, adolescent boys would attempt to steal cheeses from the altar while being savagely flogged by older youths or officials. The winner was not the one who stole the most cheese, but the one who endured the whipping the longest without crying out or collapsing. This diamastagosis, as it was called, was a brutal test of fortitude that in later Roman times actually became a bloody public spectacle, drawing tourists who marveled at or were horrified by Spartan toughness. Alongside the physical and military training, there was an emphasis on music and dance, but these two were largely martial in character. Spartan boys learned to sing stirring choral hymns and war songs, and to perform disciplined rhythmic war dances like the Pyrrhic, all designed to instill group cohesion, discipline, and patriotic fervor. They were also famously trained in laconic speech, to speak concisely, pithily, and to the point, avoiding any unnecessary words or rhetorical flourishes. Wasting words was as frowned upon as wasting food or flinching under the lash. As they progressed through the stages of the agoge, the training became even more intense. Some older youths in a highly controversial and somewhat shadowy institution known as the Cryptia were allegedly sent out into the countryside to live off the land, practicing stealth survival skills, and according to some ancient sources, particularly Plutarch, though his account is debated, to spy on and even terrorize or kill members of the Heelot population, as a means of keeping the subjugated serfs in a constant state of fear and preventing revolt. This secret police aspect, if true, reveals a very dark and brutal side to the Spartan system. Finally, at around the age of 20, if a young Spartan had successfully endured all the rigors of the agoge, he would be eligible to become a full citizen soldier, a Spartiate. He would be admitted into a Sicilian or Fedician, one of the communal dining messes where all adult male citizens took their evening meals, a practice that reinforced camaraderie and equality, at least in theory, among the warrior elite. Even after marriage, which often occurred in their 20s or early 30s, Spartan men continued to live in these barracks and dine in their messes until the age of 30, only visiting their wives in secret by stealth, a custom we will explore in great detail shortly. If you successfully graduated from the agoge, you were essentially a lean, mean, incredibly disciplined, and highly laconic fighting machine. You were ready to defend Sparta to the death, ready to marry and produce more little Spartans. Sure, but probably not exceptionally skilled at making light, witty conversation at dinner parties or discussing the nuanced emotional subtext of recent epic poetry. Pass the black broth. Battle tomorrow? End of conversation. This then Egeria was the crucible that forged the Spartan man the future husband in these peculiar marriage by capture rituals. It was a system designed to prioritize the state above all else, to value military virtue over personal comfort, and to create a citizen whose life was dedicated from childhood to old age to the service and defense of Sparta. Understanding this relentless, all-encompassing male upbringing is essential to understanding the unique and often rather startling nature of Spartan family life, and their very particular path to wedlock. You've now witnessed Egeria, the contrasting yet complementary paths of Spartan upbringing. You've seen the young Spartan girls, robust and educated in their own unique way, engaging in vigorous physical training, their bodies and spirits prepared for the crucial role of motherhood. And you followed the young Spartan men through the relentless, often brutal crucible of the agoge, that all-encompassing state-sponsored regimen designed to forge them into the most disciplined, physically tough, and unquestioningly obedient hoplite warriors in all of Greece. Both sexes, in their distinct Spartan fashions, were meticulously molded from childhood to serve the singular overarching priority of their city-state, the strength, security, and survival of Sparta itself. It should come as no surprise, then, that when it came to an institution as fundamental as marriage, the Spartan approach was once again profoundly shaped by this all-consuming interest of the state. In most other Greek city-states like Athens, for example, while marriage certainly served important social and economic functions for families such as forging alliances and ensuring the legitimate transfer of property, there was also, at least in theory, a greater sphere for private sentiment, for elaborate betrothal negotiations between families, focusing on dowries, and for wedding ceremonies that, while traditional, often involved a degree of public display and personal celebration. But in Sparta, Egeria, you'll find that marriage was viewed with a far more pragmatic, almost utilitarian, and intensely civic lens. A mainstream historical fact is that in ancient Sparta, marriage was considered less a private matter of personal affection or familial aggrandizement, and more a profound civic duty primarily aimed at procreation, specifically the production of healthy, strong children, who would grow up to become effective warriors if male, or robust mothers of future warriors if female, thereby ensuring the continued vitality and military supremacy of the Spartan state. Forget your tender candlelit dinners and the exchange of heartfelt, if slightly awkwardly composed love poems. A Spartan courtship such as it was probably involved a mutual, if unspoken, assessment of respective javelin-throwing techniques, a shared appreciation for particularly well-disciplined phalanx maneuvers, and perhaps a brief, laconic discussion about whose ancestral hoplon shield had acquired the fewest unseemly dents in recent skirmishes. "My dear Gorgo," a young Spartan warrior might eventually grunt approvingly to a prospective bride. "Your ability to run 5 miles uphill in full armor without breaking a sweat is truly captivating, and your maternal lineage is renowned for producing remarkably sturdy ankles. Shall we, procreate vigorously for the greater glory of Sparta? Romance Spartan style." The laws and customs attributed to the legendary Spartan lawgiver Lycurgus heavily regulated many aspects of life, and marriage was no exception. These laws reportedly encouraged, and in some cases perhaps even compelled, Spartan citizens to marry in a timely fashion, specifically for the purpose of begetting children for the state. Remaining a bachelor beyond a certain age for a full Spartan citizen was not looked upon favorably. It was seen as a shirking of one's civic duty, a failure to contribute to the most vital resource of the Spartan police, its future warriors. A quirky or fringe tidbit recounted by later writers like Plutarch is that Spartan bachelors who persisted in their unmarried state past an acceptable age were sometimes subjected to various forms of public ridicule or even ritual humiliation. This might include being forced to march naked around the agora, the public marketplace in the dead of winter, all while singing a rather mournful song confessing how they thoroughly deserved this embarrassing punishment for their flagrant disobedience of the state's matrimonial expectations. It's like a very chilly, very public, and distinctly Spartan version of being shamed on social media for not pulling your weight in the group project. Suddenly, that rather startling and peculiar marriage by capture ritual we're heading towards doesn't seem quite so unappealing in comparison. Does it? This intense state interest in procreation also led to what we might now recognize as a form of eugenic thinking. Though it's crucial to understand this within its ancient context, and not through a modern anachronistic lens. The Spartans believed that strong, healthy parents were more likely to produce strong, healthy offspring. This was a primary motivation behind the rigorous physical training mandated for both girls and boys. The state wasn't just interested in having any children, it wanted Spartan children. Children fit to endure the agoge, to wield a spear, to defend the polis, or to bear more such children. The timing of marriage was also considered important in this regard. Spartan men typically married somewhat later than men in other Greek cities, often around the age of 30, when they were in their physical prime after years of military training and service. Spartan women, as we've noted, also married later than their Athenian counterparts, usually in their late teens or early 20s, an age considered more conducive to healthy childbearing. The precise extent of direct state intervention in Spartan marriage choices for ordinary citizens, beyond setting these general societal expectations for eugenic fitness, timely procreation, and adherence to Lycurgan law, versus the actual role still played by individual families in arranging specific matches or the, however limited personal preferences of the individuals involved, is a complex and often debated issue among ancient historians, as our primary ancient sources, like Plutarch and Xenophon, often present an idealized or somewhat monolithic picture of Spartan society, potentially downplaying internal variations or the nuances of private life. However, the overarching principle was clear: the needs of the state in producing a robust citizenry were paramount. In Sparta, when it came to having a baby, it wasn't just a personal joy and a delightful new addition to your immediate family. It was more like you were successfully fulfilling a critically important, state-mandated production quota for future tiny, highly disciplined warriors. The F4s, those powerful Spartan magistrates, probably had detailed charts and projected birth rate targets somewhere. Excellent, another remarkably robust infant reported from the household of Agis. That's 5 bonus points for Gryffindor. I mean for the Spartan state, and an extra ration of black broth all round tonight to celebrate this auspicious contribution to our future hoplite numbers. This overwhelming focus on the procreative function of marriage naturally shaped the nature of courtship and the wedding rituals themselves. The elaborate betrothal ceremonies common in other Greek cities with their complex negotiations over dowries, though dowries certainly existed in Sparta. As we'll see, their role and emphasis were somewhat different. The exchange of symbolic gifts and the public feasting designed to display familial wealth and cement alliances were largely absent or significantly muted in Sparta. Spartan marriage customs, true to their overall societal ethos, tended towards simplicity, secrecy, and a direct, almost stark focus on the physical union for the purpose of begetting children, rather than on elaborate public displays of romantic affection, familial wealth, or individual emotional expression. The ever-present helot threat, that vast population of subjugated Messenians who tilled the land for their Spartan masters and outnumbered the Spartiate citizens by a considerable margin, was another powerful underlying driver for many of Sparta's unique social customs, including its intense focus on marriage for procreation. The survival of the Spartan state and the continued dominance of the small Spartiate warrior elite over the resentful helot masses depended entirely on maintaining a sufficient number of highly trained, utterly loyal, and physically superior Spartan soldiers. Every healthy Spartan birth was, in a very real sense, a small victory in this ongoing demographic and military struggle. Thus, as you prepare to witness the peculiar path to wedlock in ancient Sparta, Egeria, remember that you are entering a world where the personal is profoundly political, where individual desires are almost entirely subordinate to the perceived needs of the collective, and where the most intimate of human relationships, marriage and the creation of family, are viewed primarily through the lens of civic duty and the relentless existential imperative to produce more Spartans. You are now deeply immersed, Egeria, in the austere, disciplined, and rather unique social landscape of ancient Sparta. You've seen how the state's iron will shape the upbringing of both its young women, training them for robust motherhood, and its young men, forging them into peerless warriors through the relentless crucible of the agoge. And you understand that in this highly militarized collectivist society, even an institution as personal as marriage was viewed primarily through the lens of civic duty, its overriding purpose being the production of strong, healthy children to serve and perpetuate the Spartan state. This naturally leads us to a crucial question. If the goal was an endless supply of grade A Spartan babies, how then were the prospective parents, the actual partners in this procreative enterprise, chosen? Was it a matter of romantic glances exchanged during a particularly vigorous session of communal spear practice? Or did more pragmatic and perhaps rather chillingly eugenic principles hold sway? The answer, as you might expect from the ever-practical, results-oriented Spartans, leans heavily towards the latter. A mainstream historical fact is that Spartan society placed a profound and explicit emphasis on what we would now term eugenic principles when it came to marriage and procreation. They firmly believed God in the idea of like produces like, that strong, healthy, physically fit parents were far more likely to produce strong, healthy, physically fit offspring, the kind of offspring who could endure the rigors of the agoge, excel on the battlefield, and contribute to the overall vigor and military supremacy of Sparta. This wasn't necessarily based on a sophisticated understanding of genetics, of course, but on generations of empirical observation and perhaps a healthy dose of wishful thinking, all filtered through their intense focus on physical excellence. So when it came to choosing a spouse in Sparta, Egeria, the primary considerations were not typically the size of the bride's dowry, though property and inheritance still mattered. As we'll see, the political advantages of a particular family alliance, though that could play a role especially for the elite or heaven, forbid the fleeting, unreliable whims of romantic love or passionate infatuation. Instead, the key desirable qualities in a prospective marriage partner were physical health, robustness, and proven fitness. Your Spartan dating profile had such a terrifyingly anachronistic concept existed, wouldn't be filled with soft focus selfies and lists of hobbies like enjoying long contemplative walks by the Eurotas River, or quiet evenings and passionately debating the finer points of pre-Socratic philosophy. Oh no, it would be much more direct, much more Spartan. Something along the lines of Gorgo, age 19, excellent javelin arm, proven discus thrower, third place in last year's Heraean Games, slightly hampered by a minor ankle sprain, but otherwise in peak condition, can outrun a wild boar, probably haven't actually tried that one specifically, but feeling confident, and comes from a long line of remarkably fertile and impressively broad-hipped mothers. Seeking equally fit agoge-approved Spartiate male, preferably over 6 feet tall, with a commendably stoic demeanor and no discernible tendency toward excessive poetry recitation for the urgent and patriotic procreation of many, many tiny future hoplites. No weaklings, chronic coughers, or overly sensitive philosophy enthusiasts need apply. Serious inquiries only. Send a brief laconic message via your Sicilian commander. For a young Spartan man, his marriageability was largely determined by his successful completion of the agoge. This grueling upbringing, as we've seen, was designed to weed out the weak and produce paragons of physical toughness, discipline, and endurance. A man who had thrived in the agoge, who was known for his courage in mock battles, his skill with weapons, and his ability to withstand pain without complaint, was by definition considered prime husband material from the state's eugenic perspective. He had proven his genetic and physical worth. Similarly, for a young Spartan woman, her desirability as a bride was intrinsically linked to her physical health and vigor. Her state-sponsored education, with its unprecedented emphasis on athletic training, running, wrestling, throwing the discus, and javelin, was not just about making her personally strong. It was about preparing her body for the vital civic duty of healthy childbearing. A robust, athletic, and energetic Spartan maiden, one who excelled in these public displays of fitness, was seen as being more likely to produce equally robust offspring. The degree to which individual Spartans, particularly young men and women themselves, had any significant personal choice or romantic input in the actual selection of their specific spouses, versus the overriding extent to which matches were primarily determined by these eugenic considerations, perceived familial duty to the state, or even perhaps direct intervention or formal approval by state authorities or respected elders, remains a complex and often keenly debated aspect of Spartan social history. Our ancient sources, while emphasizing the eugenic ideals, offer often conflicting, idealized, or frustratingly incomplete perspectives on the precise mechanics of Spartan matchmaking and courtship, such as it was. How were these fit partners actually matched? It likely wasn't through a centralized state breeding program, despite Sparta's collectivist tendencies, though some more extreme interpretations of Lycurgan ideals might have bordered on that. More probably it was a combination of societal pressure, familial arrangement still playing a role, albeit with different priorities than in Athens, and perhaps a degree of informal observation and selection based on these prized physical attributes. The public nature of much of Spartan life, especially the athletic training and contests for both sexes, would have provided ample opportunity for young men and women and their families to observe and assess the physical qualities of potential mates. When Spartan girls participated in their athletic competitions, sometimes nude, or lightly clad, as some sources suggest, it wasn't just about promoting their own health. It was also, in a very real sense, a public display of their eugenic fitness, their suitability as future mothers of Spartan warriors. Choosing a husband in Sparta from a young woman's or her family's perspective might involve a similar mental checklist. Does he look like he could single-handedly wrestle a particularly grumpy mountain bear and emerge victorious, or at least only slightly mauled? Can he endure an entire week of eating nothing but that famously unappetizing black broth, and still manage to do 50 impressively synchronized push-ups with his messmates? Is his ancestral bronze shield commendably dented from numerous heroic state-sanctioned exploits, rather than, say, from accidentally dropping it during a tactical retreat? Excellent, he'll do. Send word to his barracks commander that we might be amenable to discussing the rather peculiar arrangements for the ritual abduction next Tuesday evening. A quirky or fringe tidbit reported by Plutarch describes a custom where Spartan girls at certain festivals would engage in satirical songs and dances good-naturedly, or perhaps not always so good-naturedly, mocking specific bachelors for their faults or praising worthy young men for their virtues. This public performance could have acted as a form of social pressure, subtly guiding matchmaking by highlighting desirable and undesirable qualities in potential spouses, all within the framework of Spartan values. The marriage market, if such a term can even be applied to Sparta's unique system, was therefore less about romantic attraction or the negotiation of vast dowries as primary drivers, and more about a collective state-endorsed concern for producing the best possible stock for the next generation of citizens. While personal attraction or compatibility might have played some secondary role, or perhaps developed after the fact, the initial impetus for a union and the qualities most highly valued were those that promised strong, healthy children capable of upholding Sparta's formidable military reputation and ensuring its continued survival in a harsh and competitive Greek world. The peculiar path to Spartan wedlock, including that rather startling marriage by capture ritual we are steadily approaching, makes much more sense when viewed through this lens of eugenic ideals and overriding state interest. You are now fully versed, Egeria, in the Spartan state's profound and unwavering interest in matrimony. An interest driven not by romantic ideals or elaborate familial alliances for wealth, but by the relentless pragmatic need to produce strong, healthy, and disciplined citizens to uphold its unique military society. You've seen how young Spartan men and women were meticulously prepared through rigorous physical training and indoctrination in Spartan values to be ideal breeding stock for this civic enterprise. The fit partners have been identified perhaps through informal observation at public athletic displays, or through more discreet familial understandings that prioritized health and eugenic potential over all else. There's no elaborate Athenian-style betrothal feast with lengthy dowry negotiations here, no public exchange of love tokens. Instead, Sparta offers a path to wedlock that is as stark as unconventional and as uniquely Spartan as everything else in its society, the rather startling and deeply peculiar ritual often described as marriage by capture, a mainstream historical fact primarily recounted by later Greek writers like Plutarch in his Life of Lycurgus. Lycurgus, being the legendary Spartan lawgiver to whom these customs were attributed, is that Spartan marriage frequently involved a ritualized abduction or harpage. This was not, it must be stressed, a violent, non-consensual act in the way we would understand abduction today, at least not in its typical state-sanctioned form. Rather, it was a prearranged, customary part of their unique wedding rites, a symbolic seizure of the bride by her intended husband. So you're getting married in Sparta, Egeria. Forget sending out elegantly inscribed save-the-date papyrus scrolls, or agonizing over floral arrangements and seating charts. Your wedding invitation is more likely to be an unspoken understanding, a nod between families, followed by a rather terse, laconic message delivered to your future husband by his barracks commander. All right, Leonidas, it's been determined that young Gorgo from the neighboring village is a suitably robust and eugenically sound match for you. On the next moonless night, you and your 3 most reliable spear buddies from the Sicilian will proceed to abduct her from behind her father's olive grove. Her father, good old Cleombrotus, will pretend to be very surprised and suitably outraged for public appearances. But he will also conveniently ensure the back gate is unlocked, and the household hounds are otherwise engaged with a particularly large and distracting joint of meat. Try not to trip over any sacred chickens in the dark. Good luck, and may your future offspring be numerous and annoyingly good at javelin throwing. Imagine the scene Egeria. It is night, perhaps a dark, moonless night, chosen for its secrecy and its air of thrilling, illicit adventure. You, the Spartan bride-to-be, are at your family home. Your groom, a young Spartiate warrior in his physical prime, perhaps around 30 years old, as was common for a first marriage for men, arrives under cover of darkness. He is not alone. He is typically accompanied by a few of his closest friends. His messmates from the Sicilian, the communal dining hall, where he still lives and eats, even if he is now to be notionally married. These friends are there to assist in the capture, to lend an air of comradely support, and perhaps to ensure things go smoothly, or at least as smoothly as a staged nocturnal abduction can reasonably be expected to go. There is a flurry of activity, a simulated struggle. You, the bride, are expected to put up a token ritualized resistance. This isn't a genuine fight for your freedom. It's part of the performance part of the tradition. Perhaps you cry out in mock alarm or feign an attempt to escape. It's a delicate balance. One imagines you need to appear suitably captured, but you probably don't want to accidentally injure your future husband too severely with an overly enthusiastic display of maidenly reluctance before he's even had a chance to contribute to Sparta's next generation of tiny, disciplined warriors. Oh no, woe is me, I am being most unexpectedly and vigorously abducted from my beloved parental home. You might exclaim, while perhaps subtly indicating to your captor, "Not that arm, you oaf, that's my good javelin-throwing arm, and please try to use your good knee for the lift. That one's been a bit dodgy since last week's rather over-enthusiastic wrestling practice." The precise degree to which this Spartan marriage by capture was always a purely symbolic and consensual ritual with full prior agreement from all parties involved the bride, the groom, and both their families, versus potentially retaining some deeply archaic, almost vestigial elements of older, more coercive marriage practices from a much earlier, less regulated period of Greek history. Or perhaps reflecting underlying societal tensions regarding gender roles and the assertion of male dominance in marital choice, is a complex subject that continues to be debated and analyzed by historians and anthropologists interpreting the often ambiguous and invariably external ancient sources. For the classical Spartan period we are considering, however, it is generally understood as a prearranged, ritualized component of an accepted marriage process. Once captured, you are not immediately paraded through the streets in a joyous, torch-lit procession as a Roman bride might be. The Spartan way is far more discreet, more secretive. Your groom and his companions spirit you away, not to his own barracks, as he doesn't yet have a separate marital home in the conventional sense, but to a prearranged, secluded location. This might be the house of a trusted friend, a quiet outbuilding, or a specially prepared room somewhere away from prying eyes. This emphasis on secrecy, on the almost illicit nature of these early marital encounters, is a striking feature of Spartan custom. The symbolism of this ritual capture is multifaceted. It could indeed be a highly stylized, symbolic remnant of genuine archaic marriage by capture practices from a much earlier, perhaps wilder prehistoric past now rendered safe and traditional. It might also serve as a kind of symbolic test of the groom's mettle, a demonstration, however performative, of his warrior-like daring stealth and ability to seize what is to be his. More profoundly, it marks a dramatic and unequivocal severance of you, the bride, from your natal family and your previous status as an unmarried maiden. You are being taken quite literally into a new sphere, a new set of allegiances. Some have also interpreted it as reflecting the Spartan state's desire to keep the focus of its young men firmly on their military duties and their bonds with their comrades in the agoge and secession, rather than allowing them to become too quickly or too overtly domesticated by the comforts and affections of married life. This whole marriage by capture business is very hush-hush, very cloak and dagger, or rather cloak and short sword. It's like Sparta's most elaborate state-sanctioned and slightly terrifying game of hide-and-seek. But the ultimate prize is a lifelong commitment to producing more Spartans, a shared devotion to the state, and a lifetime supply of very plain, very uninspiring, but undoubtedly quite nutritious black broth. Thrilling. Once you have been captured and brought to this secluded place, another Kai figure enters the scene. An older, respected married woman, often referred to as the nymph Eutria, or bridesmaid. She is not a bridesmaid in the modern sense of a similarly aged friend. She is more akin to a matron of honor, a sponsor, a guide for you, the bride, in this crucial transition. And it is she who now takes charge of your immediate and rather peculiar preparation for the next stage of this strange Spartan path to wedlock. A preparation that involves a transformation as stark and as symbolic as the capture itself. The dramatic, if somewhat performative, capture is complete Ageria. You, the Spartan bride-to-be, have been spirited away from your family home under the cloak of night by your intended husband and his band of trusty, probably slightly giggling warrior companions. The shouts of mock alarm and feigned resistance have faded. You now find yourself in a secluded, unfamiliar location. Perhaps a quiet farmhouse belonging to a friend of the groom, a discreetly prepared outbuilding, or even just a darkened, specially designated room within a larger dwelling. Your groom and his comrades, their part in this nocturnal escapade fulfilled for now, have likely vanished back into the darkness, returning to their communal barracks as their lives as Spartiate soldiers, even on the cusp of marriage, continue with unwavering rigor. You are left not entirely alone, but in the company of a crucial figure in this next even more peculiar stage of your Spartan path to wedlock, the nymph Eutria. This nymph Eutria, often translated somewhat inadequately as bridesmaid, is not a giggling contemporary chosen for her ability to coordinate ribbon colors or plan a pre-wedding feast. She is an older, respected married woman, likely a kinswoman or a trusted friend of your family or your groom's. Chosen for her experience, her discretion, and her knowledge of these ancient Spartan customs. She is your guide, your attendant, your ritual preparer in this liminal space between maidenhood and marriage. And her next actions will transform you in ways that would seem utterly bizarre, if not downright alarming, to a bride from almost any other Greek city-state. A mainstream historical fact, vividly recounted by Plutarch in his Life of Lycurgus, is that after the ritual capture, the Spartan bride underwent a series of highly unusual preparations at the hands of this nymph Eutria. These were designed not to adorn her in conventional feminine finery, but to transform her, at least temporarily, into something quite different. Something that blurred the expected gender lines of the ancient world. So, you've been successfully captured by your future husband, who has now, with commendable Spartan efficiency, promptly disappeared back to his all-male military dorm to get a good night's sleep before morning drills. Your bridal makeover, Spartan style, now begins under the stern but capable supervision of the nymph Eutria. Step 1, a very chic, incredibly practical, and startlingly boyish short haircut, probably administered with some rather utilitarian iron shears by this no-nonsense matron. "There you go, dear," she might say as your long maidenly tresses fall to the floor. So much more aerodynamic for, all those future vigorous Spartan motherhood activities, and much less likely to get tangled in your spear during mock battles with your future sons. Practicality first always. Yes, your hair often. A symbol of feminine beauty and status in the ancient world is cropped close to your head. This is a dramatic, almost shocking act of transformation. A clear visual severing of your ties with your previous life as an unmarried girl. It's a stark contrast to the elaborate flower-decked coiffures of brides in other Greek cities, or the intricate crines of a Roman bride we might have explored in another sleepy journey. But the transformation doesn't stop there. Next, the nymph Eutria dresses you not in a flowing white bridal gown or a richly embroidered peplos, but in distinctly masculine attire. You are clad in a man's cloak, perhaps the simple, dark woolen triband favored by Spartan warriors for its austerity or a more general Himation. And you are shod in men's sandals. The overall effect is to make you appear, at least superficially, like a youth, perhaps one of the younger boys from the Agoge. It's the height of Spartan, I just successfully wrestled a wolf to a standstill, and now I'm fully prepared for my secret wedding night assignation fashion. Very utilitarian. Very not what you would have seen featured in the Athenian bridal-style guides, had such things existed on easily accessible papyrus scrolls. The precise symbolic meaning and the intended psychological effect of this ritualistic cropping of the Spartan bride's hair and the act of dressing her in men's clothing immediately prior to her first marital encounter, whether it was primarily intended to de-emphasize her overt femininity and thus perhaps reduce the groom's potential nervousness or distraction from his military mindset, to symbolically incorporate her into the predominantly male warrior ethos of Spartan society by making her temporarily resemble a youth, to facilitate the groom's necessarily clandestine and hurried visits by making the encounter less like a conventional domestic scene, or if it served as a remnant of even older, perhaps pre-Dorian tribal initiation rites involving gender transformation, remain subjects of diverse and fascinating interpretations among scholars of Spartan social history, gender studies, and ancient ritual. Once these rather startling preparations are complete, your hair shorn, your body clad in masculine garb, the nymph Eutria then leads you to a simple pallet or bed, perhaps just a pile of straw or rushes spread on the floor in a room that is deliberately kept dark or very dimly lit. And there she leaves you alone to await the secret arrival of your new husband. So there you are, Egeria, sporting your brand new, extremely short haircut, rocking a rather fetching man robe, and some very sensible, no-nonsense sandals, waiting patiently in a dark, unfamiliar room on what is essentially a pile of straw. It's all feeling decidedly less blissful romantic wedding night getaway, and rather more waiting for a secret agent rendezvous in a slightly uncomfortable and possibly quite drafty Spartan safe house. The Spartans, it must be said, really knew how to set a mood. A very specific, very austere, and slightly bewildering mood. The psychological impact of this on you, the bride, can only be imagined. There would be nervousness, certainly anticipation, perhaps a degree of confusion or even fear at these strange, almost depersonalizing rituals. This is a far cry from the gentle, celebratory, family-filled transition to marriage experienced by brides in many other cultures. Here you are isolated, transformed, waiting in the dark for a husband who is himself still bound by the strictures of his all-consuming military life. A quirky or fringe tidbit to consider is the specific tool used by the nymph Eutria to cut your hair. While ancient sources like Plutarch don't usually detail such minutiae, one can imagine it wasn't a pair of delicate, ornate golden shears from a lady's cosmetic box. More likely, it was a simple, sharp iron knife or a pair of sturdy shears used for shearing sheep, adding to the overall austerity and practicality of the ritual. There were no elaborate bridal hairstyling sessions involving fragrant oils, intricate braiding flowers, and pearl-encrusted hairpins at this particular stage for a Spartan bride. Quite the opposite, in fact. Quite the the emphasis was on stripping away on a kind of symbolic reduction to a more primal, less conventionally feminine state, perhaps to align you more closely with the harsh, unadorned realities of Spartan existence, or to emphasize that your primary value to the state was not as an object of beauty, but as a future mother of strong Spartan children. The purpose of these peculiar rituals so alien to other Greek customs has been much debated. Some suggest it was to make the initial encounters between husband and wife less about romantic love or overt sexual passion, which the Spartans viewed with some suspicion as potentially undermining military discipline and loyalty to the state, and more about the straightforward, almost comradely duty of procreation. By making you the bride appear somewhat like a boy, it might have made the encounter less jarring for a young husband, accustomed almost exclusively to the all-male environment of the ajoie and the barracks. Others see it as a powerful rite of passage forcefully marking your transition from one state of being to another, a symbolic death of your maidenhood and a rebirth into your new role. The secrecy, the darkness, the masculine attire, all could contribute to a sense of entering a new, almost hidden phase of life, one where your primary allegiance was now to your husband, and through him to the Spartan state's eugenic imperatives. Whatever the deepest meanings now lost to us, the bride transformed awaits. The rather startling transformation is complete Egeria. You, the Spartan bride. Sit alone in a darkened, unfamiliar room, your long, maidenly hair cropped close like a boy's, your body clad in the simple, somewhat rough, masculine cloak and sandals provided by the Nympheutria. That experienced matron, having performed her peculiar duties with brisk Spartan efficiency, has now departed, leaving you to the silence, the shadows, and the churning mixture of anticipation, nervousness, and perhaps a profound sense of bewilderment at these truly unconventional nuptial rites. This is your wedding night Spartan style, and it's unlike anything a bride from Athens, Corinth, or indeed almost any other corner of the ancient world could possibly imagine. You are waiting for your husband, but he will not arrive with a joyous torch-lit procession to publicly claim you and install you as mistress of his home. Instead, he must come to you in secret by stealth, a clandestine visitor from his all-consuming life in the military barracks. A mainstream historical fact consistently reported by ancient writers like Plutarch and Xenophon, who detailed Spartan customs, is that Spartan men, even after they were formally married, which typically occurred when they were in their 20s or around the age of 30, continued to live full-time in their military barracks and dine in their communal messes, the syssitia or fiditia, until they reached the age of 30 and sometimes even beyond, depending on their military rank and responsibilities. This meant that a newly married Spartan husband did not simply set up a new household with his bride. Instead, he would visit her in secret, typically under the cover of darkness, and then crucially, he had to return to his barracks before dawn to sleep alongside his warrior comrades, as if nothing out of the ordinary had occurred. This practice of clandestine marital visits could continue for a considerable period, sometimes for several years, and even according to some accounts after children had been born. So, imagine your new Spartan husband, Leonidas, or perhaps young Agesilaus, fresh from his own rather less transformative but equally tradition-bound pre-nuptial preparations. He has likely shared his usual austere evening meal of black broth and barley bread with his messmates, in the Syssitian perhaps enduring some good-natured, if typically laconic teasing from his comrades, who are in on the secret of his impending nocturnal adventure. Then, as the barracks fall quiet and his fellow warriors are asleep on their hard reed beds, he must begin his clandestine journey to you. Your new Spartan husband isn't just a warrior by day. He's now also a highly skilled practitioner of what one might call aggressive ninja stealth matrimonial edition by night, sneaking out of the heavily disciplined military barracks without alerting the sentries or his ever-vigilant barracks commander, tiptoeing silently through the moonlit, or moonless even better for secrecy, olive groves and unlit village paths, perhaps having to artfully dodge a grumpy night watchman, who in a small town like Sparta is probably his old, extremely observant drill sergeant from the Agai, the one with eyes in the back of his head and an uncanny ability to detect unauthorized nocturnal excursions for the purpose of, well, procreation. All this just for a brief, highly secretive and state-approved, if not exactly publicly celebrated procreative visit with his lawfully, if rather unusually wedded wife. It's like Mission Conjugal Impossible, Spartan Chronicles. He arrives at the secluded house or room where you, Egeria, await in your boyish disguise and your cropped hair. The encounter itself in these early days of your marriage is likely to be brief, furtive, and conducted in near darkness or by the faintest glimmer of a carefully shielded oil lamp. The primary purpose of these initial meetings, as understood within the Spartan eugenic framework, was straightforward: the procreation of healthy children for the state. While personal affection might certainly exist or develop, the emphasis of these clandestine visits, at least as described by the ancient sources, was less on leisurely romantic intimacy or the gentle forging of deep emotional bonds, and more on the efficient fulfillment of a civic and biological duty. Early Spartan marital conversations, one imagines, were probably incredibly short, exceptionally to the point, and conducted in very hushed whispers given the time constraints and the overarching need for absolute secrecy. Greetings, wife. Procreation for the greater glory and future military strength of Sparta excellent. Task accomplished. I must now depart with utmost stealth. Barracks inspection is at 0500 hours. Do not under any circumstances tell anyone I was here, especially not Sergeant Dracon. He gets awfully grumpy if his warriors are not fully rested from morning javelin practice. Very romantic, very Spartan, Anik. Why this extraordinary emphasis on secrecy? This deliberate separation of husband and wife even after marriage? Plutarch, drawing on earlier traditions about Lycurgus, offers several explanations. Firstly, it was believed that keeping the couple apart, making their encounters difficult and infrequent, would heighten their desire for each other and ensure that their physical union was always passionate and vigorous, thereby leading to the conception of stronger, healthier children. It was a kind of eugenics through enforced longing and athletic consummation. Secondly, it was intended to maintain the young husband's primary loyalty and focus on his military duties and his comrades in the secession. Domestic life, with its comforts and emotional attachments, was seen as potentially softening a warrior dulling his martial edge. By keeping him in the barracks immersed in the all-male, highly disciplined military environment, Sparta ensured that his primary identity remained that of a soldier. Thirdly, these secret visits were seen as a way of teaching the young husband self-controlled discipline and cunning, valuable warrior traits that he had to employ just to spend a few precious stolen moments with his own wife. The true emotional and psychological impact of these prolonged periods of clandestine marital visits and enforced separation on actual Spartan couples, and the precise degree of genuine secrecy that was actually maintained, versus it being a more socially understood, if officially unacknowledged, open secret or convention within the community, are exceptionally difficult for modern historians to fully assess with certainty, given that our primary ancient sources like Plutarch were often outsiders looking and sometimes idealizing or exoticizing Spartan customs. And we lack direct personal testimonies from Spartan men and women of that era describing their own intimate feelings or experiences within this unique marital system. A particularly quirky or fringe tidbit also from Plutarch suggests that this system of extreme secrecy was sometimes so effective that some Spartan men reportedly fathered several children with their wives before their fathers-in-law, or even sometimes other members of the community, had ever formally seen them in daylight, in the company of their daughters, or had even officially realized they were definitively married beyond the initial capture agreement. The first rule of Spartan Spartan Marriage Club, is you do not talk about Spartan Marriage Club, especially not to your stern-faced, no-nonsense barracks commander, unless you particularly fancy an extra invigorating round of being vigorously encouraged towards greater stoicism, with the enthusiastic application of bundled reeds for dereliction of your primary nocturnal military snoozing duty. So, night after night, or perhaps only on specific prearranged occasions, this peculiar ritual would unfold. Your husband Lucius would make his stealthy journey from barracks to bedroom, spend a brief, intense period with you, and then before the first hint of dawn could betray his absence, he would slip away again, back to his life as a soldier. Among soldiers, leaving you Egeria, alone once more in your darkened room. A wife, yet not quite a wife in the conventional sense. A partner in a marriage that was in its early stages a creature of shadows, whispers, and carefully guarded secrets, all for the greater glory of Sparta. The shadowy, almost illicit ritual of your Spartan wedding night, Egeria, has now unfolded. Your hair cropped short, clad in the stark simplicity of a man's cloak and sandals, you have awaited your new husband Leonidas in that darkened, secluded room. He, in turn, has successfully navigated the perils of a clandestine nocturnal visit, slipping away from the iron discipline of his military barracks, his secession to spend a few brief, furtive hours with you, his lawfully, if rather unusually wedded wife. And then just as silently, just as stealthily before the first hint of Laconian dawn can betray his absence, he has departed, returning to his life as a soldier among soldiers, leaving you to contemplate the peculiar nature of your new marital status. For this you soon realize is not just a one-night affair of secrecy. It is the very pattern of your early married life. You are wedded, yes, but you are also for a considerable time destined to live largely apart your domestic life, dramatically and deliberately delayed by the overriding priorities of the Spartan state. A mainstream historical fact and one of the most distinctive and often commented upon features of Spartan society was this practice of delayed cohabitation for married couples. Even after the marriage by capture and the consummation of the Union, Spartan husbands, particularly those under the age of 30, typically continued to reside full-time in their military barracks with their comrades. Their daily life remained centered around the rigorous demands of military training, their communal meals in the secession, and the intense bonds of loyalty forged within their all-male warrior brotherhood. So, you're a newly married Spartan. Congratulations, your husband will now continue to live with his army buddies in a probably quite smelly and definitely very austere barracks on the other side of town. You get the house, or at least your designated room within your father's or a relative's house, as you don't yet have a fully shared marital home with him, and the thrilling, ongoing anticipation of occasional, very stealthy, and always rather brief nocturnal visits. It's like having a superhero husband whose main superpower is extreme dedication to communal living and a remarkable ability to avoid most domestic chores until he hits the big 3-0. Why this extraordinary system of marital separation? Egeria. Why would a society so focused on procreation deliberately make it so inconvenient for husbands and wives to actually, spend quality time together and conveniently procreate? The reasons, according to ancient writers like Plutarch and Xenophon, who sought to explain Spartan customs, often with a degree of idealization, were deeply rooted in the core values and perceived needs of the Spartan state. Firstly, as we've touched upon, there was the unwavering desire to maintain the military readiness and martial focus of its young warriors. Domestic life, with its comforts, its emotional entanglements, its potential for softening a man, was viewed with considerable suspicion. By keeping young husbands in the barracks immersed in the disciplined all-male environment of their fighting units, Sparta ensured that their primary loyalty remained to the state and to their comrades in arms. The bonds forged in the agoge and reinforced daily in the secession were considered paramount for the cohesion and effectiveness of the Spartan phalanx. A wife, however beloved or eugenically sound, was seen as a potential distraction from this overriding military duty. Secondly, and somewhat paradoxically, this enforced separation and the clandestine nature of marital visits were believed by the Spartans to actually enhance desire and promote more vigorous and therefore more successful procreation. Plutarch suggests that Lycurgus instituted this custom so that husbands and wives, meeting only infrequently and by stealth, would approach their encounters with greater passion and physical vigor, their desire undulled by constant familiarity. This in turn was thought to lead to the conception of stronger, healthier, more robust offspring, the ultimate Spartan goal. It was a kind of eugenics achieved through strategically managed romantic scarcity and the illicit thrill of a forbidden or at least highly secretive rendezvous. Spartan date night, therefore, was basically your husband Leonidas successfully executing a complex military-grade infiltration of your heavily guarded by social custom, at least sleeping quarters, navigating a series of potentially booby-trapped olive groves, and avoiding the ever-watchful eyes of any insomniac neighborhood elders, and then spending a tense but hopefully biologically productive 20 minutes with you before having to sprint back to the barracks for the 500 hours spear polishing and synchronized grunting duty. Very romantic, incredibly efficient, and quintessentially Sparta. Thirdly, these secret visits were seen as a continuation of the agoge's training in discipline, self-control, and cunning. A young husband had to be resourceful, stealthy, and extremely discreet to manage these nocturnal assignations without being caught by his barracks mates or his superiors. Being discovered could lead to shame, ridicule, or even punishment. Not for the act of visiting his wife per se, as that was expected for procreation, but for the clumsiness or lack of discipline involved in getting caught doing so. The actual lived experience and the true emotional consequences of this prolonged and quite peculiar system of marital separation for Spartan couples, particularly for the young wives who were expected to manage households, or at least their own affairs within their natal households, and often raise very young children largely in their husband's conspicuous daytime absence, and the real impact this had on marital intimacy, emotional bonding, and overall family dynamics, are areas where direct personal testimony from Spartans themselves is entirely lacking, forcing historians and sociologists to rely heavily on interpretations of the often idealized or critical accounts provided by external ancient sources and on cautious comparative insights from social anthropology. A quirky or fringe tidbit again from ancient writers like Xenophon suggests that this system of maintaining a certain unfamiliarity and heightened desire between spouses was sometimes so effective, or the secrecy so well maintained, that a Spartan husband might reportedly become a father several times over before he had ever actually shared a daylight meal with his wife in their own home, or even been seen publicly with her in a casual domestic setting. The first rule of Spartan Marriage Club, is you do not talk about Spartan Marriage Club, especially not to your stern-faced, incredibly observant barracks commander, unless you particularly fancy an extra invigorating round of being vigorously encouraged towards greater levels of stoicism and discretion, with the enthusiastic and repeated application of bundled reeds to your nether regions for dereliction of your primary nocturnal military snoozing and/or successful procreative sneaking duties. For you, the Spartan wife Egeria, this period of delayed domesticity would mean a considerable degree of independence and responsibility, at least within your own sphere. You would be managing your affairs, perhaps overseeing aspects of your dowry property, and if children arrived, taking on the primary role in their very early upbringing, largely without the daily presence or interference of your husband. This contributed to the reputation of Spartan women for being relatively autonomous and capable, at least compared to their more secluded Athenian counterparts. This unusual arrangement would typically continue until the husband reached the age of 30. At that point, he was finally released from the obligation of living full-time in the barracks and was permitted to establish his own separate household oikos with you, his wife, and any children you might have had during those years of clandestine visits. This would mark a significant transition, a second phase of your marriage, where you could finally begin to live together openly as a conventional, by other Greek standards at least, family unit. Imagine after a decade or so of these fleeting, shadowy encounters, finally being able to have breakfast with your husband, or discuss the household accounts in broad daylight without fear of discovery. It would be like, "Oh, hello there, esteemed warrior stranger I've been occasionally procreating with in the dead of night for the past 10 years. So this is what you look like when you're not trying to sneak past a sleeping sentry, and you own a spare tunic and possibly a slightly chipped drinking cup. Fascinating. Welcome to our shared and now fully sanctioned domestic bliss. This prolonged period of living apart while still being formally wedded. This prioritization of state military duties and communal male bonding over private domestic life is one of the most defining and peculiar characteristics of the Spartan social system, a clear testament to its unique, all-encompassing, and often rather startling set of values. You are now Egeria, a duly, if rather secretly wedded Spartan wife. Your husband Leonidas, after his brief clandestine nocturnal visits to your darkened chamber, where you await him with your boyishly cropped hair and clad in his spare cloak, dutifully returns before dawn to the austere camaraderie of his military barracks and the unappetizing delights of the communal black broth. This unusual period of delayed domesticity, where you are married yet living largely separate lives, prioritizing state duties and military cohesion above all else, could, as we've seen, continue for a considerable time, perhaps even for years, until he finally reaches the age of 30 and is permitted to establish a proper household with you. This unique living arrangement, so different from the immediate cohabitation expected in most other Greek city-states, undoubtedly contributed to another rather remarkable and distinctive feature of Spartan society: the surprisingly significant property rights and economic clout wielded by Spartan women, particularly concerning their dowries and inherited land. While your Athenian sister-in-law, poor thing, is likely confined to the gynoeceum, her property, if any, managed entirely by her male curious guardian, and her public appearances strictly limited you. The Spartan matron are navigating a world where women could and did own and control substantial wealth, especially land. This economic independence would have profoundly shaped your status, your influence within the family, and your overall experience of married life in austere Laconia. Forget just being in charge of the household linen closet and ensuring the olive oil rations don't run out too quickly. As a Spartan woman, you might well be making executive decisions about your vast ancestral olive groves, your herds of prize-winning Laconian sheep, and precisely which troublesome helots need a stern talking to about their less than enthusiastic approach to agricultural productivity. Darling Leonidas, you might casually remark to your barracks-dwelling husband during one of his fleeting moonlit visits, "I've had a rather successful quarter with the barley harvest from my inherited northern estates. I've decided to acquire another 100 plethora of prime grazing land down by the Eurotas. Do try not to get it too muddy with your war chariot on your next secret nocturnal visit, there's a good chap. A mainstream historical fact, and one that consistently astonished and sometimes scandalized other Greeks, particularly Athenians, is that Spartan women uniquely among most ancient Greek city-states possessed significant legal rights to inherit, own, and manage property, most crucially including land kleroi, the allotments that form the basis of Spartiate citizenship. By the classical period, and perhaps even more so in later Hellenistic times, as the number of male Spartiate citizens dwindled due to constant warfare, women reportedly came to control a truly substantial portion, with ancient estimates varying from a considerable 1/3 to an astonishing 2/5 of all Spartan land. This gave them a degree of economic independence and societal influence unparalleled by their female counterparts in most other parts of the Greek world. How did this unusual situation arise? Several factors likely contributed. Firstly, Sparta's unique inheritance laws. While sons were the primary heirs to their father's kleros, the ancestral land allotment that supported his citizenship and contribution to the Sicilian daughters could also inherit land, especially if there were no male heirs or they might receive land as part of their dowry proe. Secondly, the high mortality rate among Spartan men who were engaged in almost constant military training and frequent, often brutal warfare meant that many women outlived their husbands, fathers, and brothers, leading to property passing into female hands through inheritance or widowhood. Thirdly, the very system that kept husbands away from home for so much of their early married lives. Living in barracks and engaged in military duties naturally meant that women had to take on greater responsibility for managing household estates and agricultural production. They weren't just sitting at home weaving demurely, they were often de facto estate managers. The Spartan dowry, while still a feature of marriage, seems to have functioned somewhat differently than in Athens, where it was primarily a transfer of wealth from the bride's family to the groom to contribute to her maintenance but remained under the control of her male guardian. In Sparta, while the dowry certainly served to support the new household, the property, which could include land, livestock, or other valuables, brought by a woman into her marriage often appears to have remained more distinctly under her influence, or even her direct control, especially if it was land she had inherited in her own right. The precise legal mechanisms by which Spartan women formally managed their landed property, the exact extent of their direct independent control over its resources and revenues versus a reliance on male relatives or designated overseers for its day-to-day administration, and the full social and political implications of their significant land ownership within a fundamentally militaristic and male-dominated state continue to be complex and debated subjects among historians, often hampered by the scarcity of direct personal testimony or detailed legal documents from Spartan women themselves outlining their economic activities. Nevertheless, the economic clout this land ownership afforded Spartan women was undeniably real. Owning land meant controlling the agricultural produce that sustained life, and crucially, it meant controlling the helot labor that worked that land. This economic power translated into a degree of social influence and personal autonomy that was remarkable for the ancient Greek world. Spartan women were not entirely dependent on their husbands or male relatives for their economic well-being or their social standing. This financial independence likely contributed significantly to their famous confidence, their well-documented outspokenness, which other Greeks often found shocking or unwomanly, and their relative freedom of movement and participation in public life, such as attending athletic contests or religious festivals. A Spartan woman whose husband Leonidas was perhaps being particularly annoying or failing. His admittedly limited in these early years domestic contributions could at least theoretically remind him that a significant portion of the black broth he so stoically consumed in his Sicilian was likely produced from barley, grown on her ancestral land tilled by helots effectively under her indirect control. That's a rather potent form of domestic leverage. Yes, my dearest Leonidas, she might sweetly coo, your observations on the current geopolitical situation with Argos are as always remarkably insightful. Now, about the rather urgent need for a new roof on the western granary of my lower 40 acres. This situation, of course, did not go unnoticed or uncriticized by some external observers. The great Athenian philosopher Aristotle in his Politics famously criticized Sparta for what he saw as its gynaikokratia, a state ruled or unduly influenced by women, blaming the Spartan women's extensive land ownership and perceived luxury a rather ironic accusation, given Sparta's official austerity for a decline in public morals, and more practically for a dangerous reduction in the number of male Spartiate citizens, as land became concentrated in fewer, often female-controlled hands, making it harder for some men to meet the property qualifications for full citizenship. You can almost hear those famously forthright Spartan women collectively rolling their eyes from across the centuries at Aristotle's pronouncements. "Oh, Aristotle, my dear Athenian philosopher." One can imagine a wealthy Spartan matron retorting with a wry smile. Perhaps if you spent a little less time engaging in abstract philosophical contemplation in your shaded lyceum and a bit more time actually trying to manage a large agricultural estate during a Helot rebellion, while simultaneously ensuring the production of at least 3 eugenically sound future hoplites, you might develop a slightly more nuanced appreciation for the practicalities of land management and female economic resilience. Now, if you'll excuse me, my prize-winning herd of Laconian goats is due for its afternoon serenade, and then I simply must oversee the pressing of the olives. It's a woman's work, you know. A quirky or fringe tidbit that highlights this unique economic position is that Spartan women, unlike their Athenian counterparts, who were largely excluded from legal proceedings, could apparently engage in business transactions and even appear in court in matters relating to their property. This level of legal and economic agency was truly exceptional. So, while your Spartan husband Egeria is off living his best life in the barracks, honing his warrior skills and bonding with his comrades over bowls of famously unappetizing soup, you are not necessarily just a passive pining Penelope figure back at the homestead. You are potentially a landowner, an estate manager, a woman of considerable economic means and influence, playing a vital, if often underappreciated by outsiders, role in the unique social and economic fabric of Lacedaemon. This economic clout, this control over women's land, is another fascinating and peculiar thread in the strange and wonderful tapestry of Spartan life. You are now deeply familiar, Egeria, with the rather unique landscape of Spartan matrimony. You've seen how the state's relentless focus on producing strong warrior citizens shaped the upbringing of both its young men and women, turning them into paragons of physical fitness and disciplined duty. You've witnessed the peculiar ritual of marriage by capture, the bride's startling transformation with cropped hair and masculine attire, the groom's clandestine nocturnal visits from his military barracks, and the surprisingly significant economic clout wielded by Spartan women through their land ownership and dowries. It's a system built on pragmatism, civic obligation, and eugenic ideals. But amidst all this austerity, this relentless prioritization of the state over the individual, this almost aggressively unsentimental approach to forming families, you might find yourself quietly wondering, was there any room at all for romantic love, for genuine affection, for the tender emotional bonds that we so often associate with marriage in this famously harsh and warrior-centric culture? It's a question that naturally arises when confronted with customs that seem so alien to modern sensibilities of love and courtship. A mainstream historical fact is that while Spartan marriage was indeed primarily a civic institution designed for procreation, for the benefit of the state, and overt public displays of romantic affection or passion were actively discouraged by their famously austere and disciplined culture. It is highly probable that personal affection, loyalty, mutual respect, and even deep companionship could, and undoubtedly often did, develop between Spartan spouses, particularly in the later stages of marriage once they began to live together more conventionally. However, such private emotions were almost always expected to be subordinate to their overriding duty to Sparta. Love, if it blossomed, was a private bloom in a very public state-controlled garden. The ancient sources we rely on for our understanding of Sparta, writers like Plutarch, Xenophon, and Aristotle, tend to focus on the political, military, and social structures of Lacedaemon, rather than the intimate emotional lives of its citizens. They describe the laws, the customs, the institutions, but rarely offer us glimpses into the private stirrings of Spartan hearts. The Spartans themselves, with their famous laconic nature, were not given to effusive emotional displays or the kind of introspective romantic literature that flourished in, say, Athens. We have no surviving Spartan love poetry to rival Sappho, no heartfelt letters between Spartan husbands and wives detailing their deepest affections. Their public persona, at least, was one of stoic self-control and emotional restraint. So, if you were looking for grand romantic gestures in Sparta Egeria, you'd likely be sorely disappointed. Valentine's Day in ancient Sparta had such a frivolous concept ever been allowed to take root amidst their rigorous training schedules, probably would have involved the thoughtful exchange of a particularly well-balanced new spear point, or perhaps a beautifully polished whetstone for keeping one's short sword in peak fighting condition. Flowers, chocolates, and sentimental verses were almost certainly deemed insufficiently conducive to military preparedness and liable to induce un-Spartan softness. Though one might argue a well-aimed javelin through the heart of a common enemy of Sparta, perhaps dedicated to one's spouse, could be considered quite romantic in a very specific, uniquely Spartan and rather terrifying sort of way. Yet to assume that Spartan marriages were entirely devoid of affection would be to misunderstand the complexities of human emotion, which has a remarkable ability to adapt and find expression even within the most restrictive of social frameworks. Consider again those clandestine nocturnal visits by the young Spartan husband to his new wife. Plutarch, in explaining this custom, argues that these secret, infrequent, and somewhat stolen encounters fraught with the risk of discovery actually served to keep the couple's desire for each other fresh and vigorous, preventing them from becoming overly familiar, or heaven forbid, bored with each other too quickly. He suggests that they came together with a store of love and youthful vigor, their passion heightened by the secrecy and the challenge. It's a rather counterintuitive argument from a modern perspective, that enforced separation and a constant low-level fear of being caught by your barrack sergeant might be the key to a spicy love life, but it hints that these encounters were not necessarily envisioned as purely cold mechanical acts of procreation. Could genuine affection, a thrill of shared secrecy, and a unique kind of intimacy have blossomed in those darkened rooms in those brief, stolen hours, before the husband had to slip away again to his military duties? It's certainly plausible. Spartan pillow talk one imagines during those fleeting, highly secretive nocturnal visits was probably incredibly efficient and very much to the point. Greetings, esteemed wife. Did you observe the new phalanx drill maneuvers in the training field today? Most impressive. We clearly need more strong sons like young Brasidas to fill the ranks. Right then, procreative duty for Sparta, now successfully accomplished. I really must be going. Barracks inspection is at 0500 hours, and Sergeant Myron has a particularly unpleasant disposition if he catches anyone looking even remotely sleepy. Do not under any circumstances tell anyone I was here, especially not him. Very passionate, very efficient. The true nature and actual depth of the emotional bonds that typically formed within Spartan marriages, and the extent to which genuine romantic love as understood in other more expressive ancient or modern cultures could truly flourish amidst the Spartan state's overwhelming emphasis on eugenic procreation. Civic duty and extreme emotional restraint remain largely elusive and are subject to considerable ongoing scholarly debate. But with historians carefully sifting through the often idealized or heavily critical external perspectives of our primary ancient sources, searching for subtle hints of personal feeling within a social system that so actively discouraged its public display. As the couple aged, and particularly after the husband reached the age of 30 and was finally permitted to live openly with his wife and establish a proper household, there would have been far more opportunity for a deeper, more conventional companionship to develop. Having successfully navigated the peculiar rigors of early Spartan married life, having produced healthy children for the state, and now sharing the responsibilities of managing an estate and a household, a strong bond of mutual respect, loyalty, and shared experience could certainly solidify. Perhaps true Spartan love wasn't about whispered sweet nothings under a Laconian moon or passionate declarations of undying devotion. Perhaps it was found in that quiet, unspoken shared understanding when you both successfully managed to raise a child who could not only endure the full brutality of the agoge without crying too much, at least not where anyone important can see, but who then goes on to bring significant honor to Sparta by not being the first one to break ranks in a crucial battle. That kind of shared parental and civic pride, that deep investment in a common purpose, has got to be worth at least a couple of very well-rationed, if slightly watery, black broth toasts in celebration. A quirky or fringe tidbit that suggests romantic or aesthetic sensibilities were not entirely alien to Spartan culture, especially in its earlier periods, before it became quite so famously austere, comes from the fragments of poetry by figures like Alcman, a 7th century BCE Spartan poet. His works, often choral lyrics performed by groups of young women, sometimes speak of love, beauty, and the charms of nature, hinting at a richer emotional and artistic life than the later Spartan mirage often allows for. While this doesn't directly translate to marital romance in the classical period, it suggests that the Spartan soul wasn't entirely devoid of the softer sentiments. Ultimately, Egeria. While the Spartan path to wedlock was undeniably strange, focused on duty, and seemingly designed to minimize private affection, in favor of public good, it would be a mistake to assume it was entirely loveless. Affection, loyalty, and deep companionship likely found their own unique, typically Spartan ways to exist and even thrive within this austere warrior culture, perhaps expressed less in overt sentiment and more in shared duty, mutual respect, and the quiet pride of contributing together to the formidable, if peculiar, glory of Lacedaemon. The austere, disciplined, and often rather secretive path to Spartan wedlock has now led you, Egeria, through the stark rituals of capture, the bride's transformative preparation, and those clandestine nocturnal visits by a husband, still bound to his military barracks. You've pondered the possibility of a unique, understated affection blooming amidst these unconventional customs, a love defined more by shared duty and stoic respect than by overt romantic display. But the peculiarities of Spartan marital and procreative arrangements, all geared towards that overriding state interest in producing a continuous supply of robust warrior citizens, do not end there. Prepare yourself for a custom that, even by Spartan standards, often raised the eyebrows of other ancient Greeks and continues to fascinate and perplex historians today: the practice of, for want of a better term, sharing spouses or loaning wives, specifically for the eugenic purpose of begetting the best possible children for Sparta. Now, before your modern sensibilities quite rightly recoil in horror or confusion, Egeria, it's crucial to understand this within its very specific, very Spartan context. This wasn't about encouraging rampant illicit affairs or a casual approach to marital fidelity as we might understand it. Far from it. Adultery, particularly a clandestine affair that dishonored a husband or threatened the legitimacy of his lineage, would still likely be viewed with severity, though Spartan attitudes even here were sometimes described by outsiders as more pragmatic than, say, those in Athens. Instead, what ancient writers like Xenophon, an Athenian admirer of Sparta, and Plutarch, a later Greek biographer drawing on earlier sources, describe are specific, socially sanctioned, at least in theory according to Lycurgan ideals arrangements, designed to maximize Sparta's most precious resource: healthy, vigorous children of pure Spartiate blood. Sparta's unique approach to family planning, you see, was less about conventional romantic candlelight and a shared devotion to household chores, and much more akin to a highly strategic, state-endorsed premium livestock breeding program, but for humans destined to become elite warriors. "My dearest Lycon," a respected elder Spartan might say to a younger, particularly athletic comrade, "your javelin arm is the stuff of legend, your endurance in the agoge was exemplary, and you possess a commendably stoic and uncomplaining disposition. My wife, the virtuous Agiotis, is, as you know, renowned for her robust constitution, and comes from a long line of exceptionally fertile mothers. For the greater good and future military strength of Sparta, would you perhaps care to contribute some of your clearly superior champion genes to our next generation? No pressure, of course, just a friendly, patriotic suggestion." A mainstream historical fact, as reported by these classical authors, is that customs existed in Sparta whereby certain husbands might permit or even actively encourage other suitable Spartan men, typically younger, stronger, or more virile individuals known for their good character and physique, to father children with their wives. This was particularly countenanced if the husband himself was older, perhaps past his prime physically, or if he simply wished to ensure his wife produced the healthiest possible offspring for the state, even if he wasn't the biological father. Conversely, a man whose own wife was barren or who desired more children than his wife could provide might, with the full consent of another husband, seek to have children by that man's fertile wife. The children born from such arrangements were apparently considered legitimate and would often be raised within the household of the social father, the husband of the mother, contributing to his lineage or at the very least to the overall citizen body of Sparta. The emphasis always was on the good stock, the quality of the offspring. Lycurgus, according to Plutarch, supposedly instituted these practices because he believed it was foolish for men to take such great care in breeding their dogs and horses for excellence, yet to jealously guard their wives and insist on fathering children themselves, even if they were old, sickly, or otherwise ill-suited for producing vigorous heirs. A quirky or fringe tidbit is Plutarch's assertion that Lycurgus actually laughed at those who think that the possession of a wife should be an exclusive and jealously guarded private right. Framing the Spartan approach as being more rational, more communal, and ultimately more beneficial to the state by prioritizing the health and quality of the children over the possessive romantic and, in Lycurgus's supposed view, rather irrational notions of monogamous exclusivity common in other societies. This is a very Spartan justification indeed, cold, logical, and entirely focused on the collective good as they defined it. The consent of the husband in such arrangements was absolutely paramount. This was not about condoning secret affairs or licentiousness. It was a deliberate, open, at least between the men involved, and socially, if peculiarly sanctioned, eugenic strategy. The wife's consent and her personal feelings about these arrangements are, as is so often the case when our sources are exclusively male writers, from patriarchal societies far less clearly articulated. Was she consulted? Did she have any right of refusal, or was she expected as a patriotic Spartan woman to accept this as part of her civic duty to produce the best possible children for the state regardless of her personal preferences or emotional attachments? The actual prevalence and widespread social acceptance of these practices of wife sharing or wife loaning for specific procreative purposes among the broader Spartan citizenry, and the precise degree to which it was a formally institutionalized and state-encouraged eugenic practice versus a more informal, exceptional, or perhaps even idealized custom, primarily discussed by philosophical admirers of Sparta, like Xenophon, remain subjects of intense scholarly debate and ongoing critical examination. Complicated by the idealized or sometimes critical nature of the external ancient sources that describe these customs and the complete lack of direct, internal Spartan perspectives or legal texts explicitly detailing the mechanics or emotional impact of such arrangements. Imagine the rather unique marital discussions that might have occurred in ancient Sparta Egeria. My dearest Agiatis, your elderly but highly patriotic Spartan husband, might begin one evening after a particularly inspiring speech by an aphor about the pressing need for more future hoplites. You know how young Alcibiades down at the communal barracks has recently won the Olive Crown for his incredible spear throw, can outrun a Messenian hare, and is generally considered a prime specimen of Spartan manhood. Well, my love, it has occurred to me purely for the good of Sparta, of course, and with absolutely no reflection upon my own, shall we say slightly less vigorous procreative capacities these days. Just saying. No pressure at all, but perhaps a strategic collaboration might be in order. It's a very different kind of let's try for a baby conversation than one might encounter in most other cultures then or now. The children born from these eugenically motivated arrangements were, it seems, generally accepted as legitimate members of the social father's household, and more importantly, as future citizens of Sparta, provided they passed the initial inspection by the elders, of course. The emphasis was less on strict biological paternity within a monogamous pair bond and more on the production of high-quality individuals for the collective. This willingness to subordinate personal claims of sexual exclusivity and biological fatherhood to the perceived needs of the state is one of the most radical and distinctive aspects of Spartan society. It's also important to distinguish this practice from what other Greeks would have considered straightforward adultery. A clandestine affair undertaken without the husband's knowledge or consent would likely still have been viewed as a serious offense, a dishonor and a threat to the integrity of the household. The Spartan system, at least as idealized by its proponents, was about open agreed-upon arrangements for the specific purpose of eugenic procreation in service to the state. If you, as a Spartan citizen, happen to see a different strapping young warrior discreetly leaving your neighbor's house at dawn, you didn't necessarily jump to conclusions and immediately summon the ancient equivalent of the neighborhood watch committee. You might just nod sagely to yourself and think, ah, excellent. Another potentially robust and eugenically superior infant, probably well on its way for the future glory of Lacedaemon. Top-notch patriotic cooperation happening over there, chaps. Well done. Well done indeed. This peculiar Spartan custom, so alien to many other ancient and modern conceptions of marriage and family, underscores once again the profound extent to which the state's perceived needs permeated and shaped even the most intimate aspects of personal life in Lacedaemon. It was a society that took its eugenic mission very, very seriously. You've now witnessed Egeria some of the truly unique and to outside eyes often rather startling customs surrounding Spartan marriage and procreation. From the state's overriding interest in producing strong warrior citizens, to the eugenic ideals that guided partner selection, the ritualized marriage by capture, the bride's peculiar transformation, the husband's clandestine visits from his barracks, the delayed domesticity, the surprisingly robust property rights of Spartan women, and even those rather eyebrow-raising, at least for non-Spartans, practices concerning wife sharing or loaning for the specific purpose of begetting the best possible offspring for the state. It's a marital landscape unlike any other in ancient Greece. But what happened if, despite all these carefully structured, state-focused arrangements, a Spartan marriage simply didn't work? What if the primary goal of producing healthy children was not met? Or what if other less definable fissures appeared in the union? Was divorce even a possibility in this rigidly ordered society? And if so, how did the famously pragmatic, no-nonsense Spartans go about parting ways? While the surviving ancient sources, those precious texts by writers like Plutarch, Xenophon, and Aristotle, provide us with many fascinating, if sometimes conflicting or idealized details about how Spartans got into marriage, they are often considerably less explicit about the precise legal mechanisms and social customs surrounding how they got out of it. A mainstream historical fact is that while specific detailed Spartan laws on divorce are not as well documented as, for example, those from ancient Athens or Rome, who, as we know, loved to write everything down, preferably in triplicate, on durable materials, the available evidence strongly suggests that divorce was indeed permissible in Sparta, particularly, and perhaps unsurprisingly, in cases of childlessness. Given that the absolute, undeniable, number one with a bullet purpose of Spartan marriage was the production of healthy new citizens for the state, a union that failed to achieve this fundamental objective would likely be seen as failing in its primary civic duty, and therefore a legitimate candidate for dissolution. Imagine Spartan divorce court Egeria. If such a formal, dedicated institution even existed, it was probably more a matter for family councils or the ever-watchful ephors, those powerful Spartan magistrates. It would likely be a very efficient, very direct, and entirely unsentimental affair. Right then, case number 3 on this morning's docket, Leonidas, son of Cleombrotus, versus Gorgo, daughter of Agesilaus. Grounds for dissolution. Demonstrable and prolonged barrenness on the part of the wife, despite 3 years of diligent, state-sanctioned, clandestine, nocturnal procreative efforts. Any counter-arguments, Gorgo no excellent. Husband claims wife is barren, wife does not dispute. Divorce granted. Next. And please ensure both parties make immediate arrangements to remarry someone demonstrably fertile and eugenically sound by the next festival of Artemis Orthia, or there will be official expressions of state displeasure and possibly a reduction in your black broth ration. The state needs babies, people lots of them, childlessness. Then, especially on the part of the wife, seems to have been one of the most clearly accepted and perhaps even socially expected grounds for a Spartan man to divorce his wife and seek a new partner who might prove more fruitful. This ties directly back into those eugenic principles we've discussed, and the overarching state interest in maximizing its citizen warrior population. It also connects to the practices of wife sharing or loaning. If a wife was barren, divorce and remarriage for the husband was another perhaps more definitive option than simply borrowing another man's fertile spouse, though that too, as we saw, was apparently on the table. What about other grounds adultery by the wife? If it was the illicit clandestine kind that threatened the legitimacy of offspring and dishonored the husband, as opposed to the state-sanctioned eugenic sharing, would almost certainly be a valid reason for divorce, likely accompanied by severe social disgrace and perhaps loss of property for the adulterous wife. The actual frequency of divorce in Spartan society and the specific degree of agency that Spartan women themselves might have had in initiating or even consenting to a divorce, particularly in cases beyond clear barrenness or her own proven adultery, are exceptionally difficult to determine with any certainty. as the surviving evidence is sparse, often anecdotal, and predominantly reflects a male perspective on marital and legal affairs, leaving the female experience largely in shadow. Could a Spartan wife divorce her husband? Perhaps if he was, say, flagrantly impotent and thus failing in his procreative duty, or if he was declared an outcast or traitor by the state, thereby shaming his household. But it would undoubtedly have been a far more difficult proposition for a woman to initiate divorce than for a man in this deeply patriarchal, militaristic society. A Spartan wife deciding she wanted out of her marriage because her husband, say, had developed an annoying habit of snoring like a legion of angry boars or consistently failed to complement her new javelin throwing technique, was probably facing a rather uphill and likely entirely unsuccessful legal battle. Irreconcilable differences. In Spartan terms, probably meant something more along the lines of, he could no longer effectively throw a 7-foot spear over a distance of 50 paces, and her famously robust black broth recipe has of late become actively treasonous to the very spirit of Spartan austerity. Personal happiness, while perhaps a welcome byproduct of a functional marriage, wasn't high on the list of legally recognized grounds for formal uncoupling. The actual process of divorce, if it occurred, was likely characterized by typical Spartan pragmatism and a distinct lack of elaborate legal or ceremonial fuss. Unlike the Romans with their detailed contractual stipulations for divorce, or the Athenians with their sometimes complex legal wranglings in court, the Spartans probably handled such matters with directness and an eye towards swift resolution in favor of the state's interest. It might involve a simple declaration before witnesses, a decision by family elders, or in more contentious cases an appeal to the ephors, or even the Gerousia, the Council of Elders. The consequences of divorce would of course be significant. The social status of a divorced woman would depend heavily on the reasons for the dissolution and her own family's standing. If divorced for barrenness through no fault of her own, she might return to her natal family with her dowry, Spartan women's property rights being relatively strong as we've discussed, and be eligible for remarriage. If divorced for adultery, her fate would be far grimmer, likely involving social ostracism and severe loss of status and property. A divorced man would certainly be free, and indeed probably strongly encouraged by the state to remarry as quickly as possible to fulfill his ongoing procreative duty. The division of property in a Spartan divorce would have been a key consideration. Given that Spartan women could own and inherit land, the disposition of the wife's dowry and any property she held in her own right would need to be settled. If she was deemed at fault, she might forfeit her claims. If not, she would likely retain her property. Imagine the rather austere property settlement meeting. All right then, Leonidas, as per the elders' decree, you get to keep the slightly less dented ceremonial shield, your spare crimson loincloth, and the fond of somewhat brief memories. Gorgo, she gets her original dowry of 3 surprisingly fierce but undeniably fertile geese, that rather useful plot of land by the river that's mostly rocks, but has excellent strategic character and custody of her own dignity. The state, of course, gets first claim on any resulting children of demonstrably Spartan caliber. Is that fair? Excellent. Now both of you are expected to be remarried and actively procreating again by the next festival of Artemis Orthia. No slacking. Dismissed. A particularly quirky or fringe tidbit comes from Herodotus, who recounts the rather unusual story of the Spartan king Anaxandridas saying, his wife was barren, and the ephors, deeply concerned about the lack of a royal heir, pressured him to divorce her and take a new wife. However, Anaxandridas was apparently quite fond of his first wife and refused to cast her aside. As a compromise, the ephors allowed him to take a second wife while remaining married to the first, a rare instance of officially sanctioned bigamy in Sparta, a society that otherwise seems to have practiced monogamy, albeit with those peculiar eugenic exceptions. His second wife promptly produced an heir, the future King Cleomenes I, and then, rather ironically, his first wife also conceived and bore children. This story, while exceptional, due to its royal context, vividly illustrates the extreme pressure for heirs and the sometimes rather flexible if unconventional solutions the Spartans might countenance to achieve that overriding civic goal. So while the ideal Spartan marriage was undoubtedly a lifelong union, producing a steady stream of strong children for the state, the pragmatic Spartans recognized that things didn't always go according to plan. Divorce, though likely not undertaken lightly, and certainly not for reasons of mere personal unhappiness, was a permitted if probably unceremonial and rather direct way of parting ways, when the fundamental purpose of the marital alliance from the state's perspective was deemed to have failed. The pragmatic, if somewhat stark, Spartan approach to dissolving a marriage, particularly in cases of childlessness, has now unfolded before your sleepy contemplation, Egeria. You've seen how this society so ruthlessly focused on its own perpetuation, through a steady supply of strong warrior citizens, likely handled the uncoupling of its marital units with a characteristic lack of fuss and a keen eye on the state's procreative imperatives. But to truly appreciate just how strange, how peculiar many of these Spartan marital customs were, it's helpful to cast our gaze across the Peloponnesian mountains to their famous, and in many ways diametrically opposed, Greek rival Athens. For if Sparta represented one extreme of Greek societal organization, Athens, with its burgeoning democracy, its philosophical inquiries, and its vibrant artistic life, offered a very different, though by no means entirely modern model for love, marriage, and family. As you reflect on the Spartan path to wedlock, that emphasis on eugenic fitness, the ritualized nighttime capture of the bride, her transformative shearing and dressing in men's clothes, the husband's long years of clandestine visits from his military barracks, the delayed domesticity, and even those eyebrow-raising customs of wife sharing for procreation. It all stands in stark, almost bewildering contrast to the more conventional, if still highly traditional, wedding ways of the Athenians. An Athenian wedding, Egeria, was generally a much more public, elaborate, and family-centric affair, deeply concerned with legal contracts, property, especially dowries, and the formal, visible transfer of the bride from her father's household, oikos, to that of her new husband. It was less secret midnight mission involving stealth, a slightly alarming haircut, and a firm handshake from the state saying, "Well done, you've acquired a procreation partner," and much more big fancy multi-day public party with flowers, feasts, elaborate sacrifices, and probably a very long, very detailed PowerPoint presentation by the bride's father concerning the impressive size and specific contents of her dowry, all set to lute music. Let's start with the purpose of marriage. For Athens, like Sparta, the procreation of legitimate children to become citizens and inherit family property was absolutely vital. An Athenian man needed an heir to continue his lineage, maintain his ancestral estate, and perform the sacred family rites for the dead. However, the intense, state-controlled eugenic focus that so characterized Sparta was far less pronounced in Athens. While a healthy bride capable of bearing children was certainly desired, Athenian marriage negotiations often revolved more around the social standing of the two families and, crucially, the size and nature of the bride's dowry poa. A mainstream historical fact is that Athenian marriage customs, in stark contrast to Spartan ones, typically involved a very formal betrothal ceremony called the engai, which was essentially a public oral contract between the bride's kyrios, her male guardian, usually her father, and the groom, or his kyrios. This contract focused heavily on the terms of the dowry, which was considered essential for a legitimate Athenian marriage, and remained notionally the wife's property, intended for her support, though administered by her husband. The upbringing and status of the bride herself presented another dramatic contrast. Remember those robust, physically educated, relatively outspoken Spartan girls we met at Egeria? Your average Athenian maiden of good family was raised in a very different environment. She would typically live a much more secluded life, largely confined to the gymnasium, the women's quarters of her father's house. Her formal education would be minimal, focused primarily on domestic skills like weaving, household management, and perhaps just enough literacy and numeracy to run a prosperous home. She married very young, often around the age of 14 or 15 usually, to a man significantly older, perhaps in his late 20s or 30s. An Athenian bride raised in sheltered seclusion probably thought a thrilling adventure was successfully sneaking an extra honey cake from the kitchen pantry without alerting her stern nurse. A Spartan bride, as we know, might define a thrilling adventure as vigorously wrestling a particularly grumpy classmate to the ground in the public exercise area, and then later that night being heroically captured by her future husband under cover of darkness. Slightly different definitions of an exciting and well-rounded girlhood, wouldn't you say? The Athenian wedding ceremony, the gamos, was also a far more elaborate and public affair than the secret of Spartan rites. It often spanned several days. There would be pre-wedding sacrifices, protolea made by the bride to deities like Artemis, goddess of virginity, whom she was now leaving behind, and Hera, goddess of marriage, whose favor she now sought. The bride would undergo a ritual bath with water drawn from a sacred spring. Then came the wedding feast, typically held at her father's house, a joyous celebration with family and friends. Following the feast, the highlight was the Pompeii, the grand wedding procession where the bride, veiled and adorned, in her finest attire, though not with cropped hair or in men's clothes, was escorted from her natal home to the home of her groom. This wasn't a stealthy nighttime abduction. It was a noisy torchlit parade, often with the bride and groom riding together in a chariot, accompanied by musicians playing flutes and lyres and guests singing traditional wedding hymns, the Hymenaeos, invoking Hymen, the god of marriage. Upon arrival at the groom's house, there were further welcoming rituals. The bride might be showered with nuts and dried fruit, symbols of fertility and abundance, as she crossed the threshold. Though here she usually walked, not carried in the Spartan style, though avoiding a stumble was still important. She would be formally presented to her husband's hearth, the symbolic center of her new home, and perhaps share a symbolic piece of quince fruit or a sesame cake with him. The public singing of epithalamia songs for the bridal chamber by friends outside the door would continue, much like the Roman tradition we explored in another Sleepy Tale. Gifts would be exchanged the following day. It was all very visible, very ceremonial, very much about publicly marking the transfer of the bride and the establishment of a new legally recognized marital unit. The extent to which the idealized and somewhat romanticized portrayals of Spartan marriage customs by Athenian writers like Xenophon, who was an admirer of many aspects of Spartan society, accurately reflect the day-to-day Spartan reality, versus being partly constructed as a deliberate philosophical counterpoint or even a subtle critique of perceived Athenian societal norms, particularly concerning gender roles, education, and the perceived softness of Athenian life, remains a key area of interpretive challenge and ongoing discussion for ancient historians. It's possible that these writers, in describing Sparta, were sometimes also implicitly commenting on their own society by highlighting such stark differences. A quirky or fringe tidbit that highlights the different symbolic focus is that in Athens on the wedding day, the bride sometimes carried or was associated with a specific type of sieve or winnowing fan known as a lyknon. This object, also used in agricultural rituals and some mystery cults like the Eleusinian Mysteries, was a potent symbol of fertility, abundance, and perhaps the wife's future role in managing the household's grain stores and ensuring its prosperity. This is a very different kind of symbolic bridal accessory than, say, a Spartan bride's recently shorn hair or her borrowed masculine cloak. So as you ponder these contrasting wedding ways, Egeria, you see two distinct Greek approaches to a universal human institution. Athens, with its emphasis on dowry, legal contract, public ceremony, and the seclusion of its young brides. And Sparta, with its focus on eugenic civic duty, ritualized secrecy, and the surprising strength and relative freedom of its women, at least in the physical and economic spheres. If you had to choose Egeria as a hypothetical ancient Greek lady contemplating matrimony, would you opt for the elaborate, dowry-focused, but ultimately rather confining Athenian wedding path? Or would you brave the stark, peculiar, but perhaps strangely empowering Spartan marriage by capture, with its terrible food, its mandatory physical fitness regime, but its promise of significant property rights and a rather more outdoorsy lifestyle? It's a tough call. Maybe the best option for a truly independent spirit was just to remain single and become a highly respected, slightly feared, and exceptionally well-informed oracle at Delphi. That seems like a solid career path with good benefits and minimal required spear-chucking. You've now journeyed Egeria through the starkly contrasting wedding ways of ancient Sparta and its great rival Athens. You've seen how Spartan marriage, with its eugenic focus, its ritualized capture, its peculiar bridal transformations, its delayed domesticity, and its surprisingly robust property rights for women, stood as a unique, almost alien institution within the broader Greek world. The Athenian model, with its emphasis on dowry, public ceremony, and the seclusion of its young brides, seems almost conventional by comparison. But how did the ancient writers themselves, those keen observers and chroniclers of Greek society, perceive and interpret these strange Spartan marital arrangements? It is primarily through their eyes, particularly those of later Greek biographers and historians like Plutarch and earlier admirers like Xenophon, that we get our most detailed, if often idealized or critically filtered accounts. A mainstream historical fact is that our understanding of Spartan social customs, including their unique marriage practices, relies heavily on the writings of non-Spartan ancient authors. The Spartans themselves, with their famous laconic disdain for excessive verbiage and their focus on action rather than introspection, left very few written records detailing their own societal norms or the philosophical underpinnings of their way of life. We are therefore largely dependent on these outsider perspectives, which often viewed Sparta through a lens of either intense admiration for its perceived discipline and stability, or profound criticism of its perceived harshness and peculiarity. Plutarch, writing in the 1st and 2nd centuries CE under the Roman Empire, centuries after Sparta's classical heyday, is perhaps our most comprehensive, if not always entirely uncritical source for these customs. In his Life of Lycurgus, the semi-legendary lawgiver to whom all good and strange Spartan things were attributed, Plutarch attempts to explain and often to rationalize these peculiar marital practices. He's like that very enthusiastic, slightly pedantic historian you meet at a dinner party who, upon discovering you have a mild interest in, say, ancient Spartan plumbing, proceeds to give you a 3-hour lecture on its socio-political significance, its divine inspirations, and its profound impact on the moral fiber of Lacedaemonian society. You see, Plutarch might lean in and explain with earnest conviction it was all for civic virtue, and to ensure the children were extra robust and bouncily patriotic. It's all perfectly logical, really, if you just squint a bit and don't think about it too hard from a non-Spartan, overly sentimental perspective. Regarding the ritual of marriage by capture, Plutarch explains that Lycurgus instituted it not as a sign of lawlessness or violence, but as a way to make Spartan wives modest and temperate. He suggests that the secrecy and the abduction prevented women from becoming pampered by ilk-defa first-time pleasures, or sated by living with their husbands from the first. He also believed it ensured that men married women who were of a suitable age and physical vigor, not just those who brought a large dowry. Concerning the bride's rather startling transformation, her hair cropped short, her being dressed in men's clothing, and then left alone in a dark room, Plutarch again attributes this to Lycurgus's wisdom. He implies these practices were designed to make the initial encounters less about conventional feminine allure or overt sexual passion, and perhaps to ease the young husband accustomed almost exclusively to the all-male environment of the agauge into the unfamiliar territory of marriage. It was meant to ensure that their coming together was modest and sober, and those famously secret nocturnal visits by the husband to his new wife, followed by his prompt return to the barracks, Plutarch offers a surprisingly modern-sounding justification for this. He argues that this enforced separation and the difficulty of their meetings actually kept their desire for each other fresh and strong. By making their encounters rare and furtive, he writes, they would approach each other with greater passion and physical vigor, which in turn was believed to lead to the conception of healthier and more robust offspring. It's the ancient Greek equivalent of the absence makes the heart grow fonder, and also possibly leads to more eugenically superior babies, especially if there's a mild but persistent risk of your drill sergeant catching you sneaking out after curfew school of romantic thought. Very practical, very Spartan. Plutarch also addresses and largely defends that most peculiar Spartan custom of wife sharing or wife loaning for procreative purposes. He attributes this too to Lycurgus, framing it as a rational eugenic practice designed to produce the best possible citizens for the state. Lycurgus, according to Plutarch, laughed at those who think that the possession of a wife should be an exclusive and jealously guarded private right. Instead, he encouraged worthy older men with young wives to allow younger, vigorous men of good character to father children with them, and similarly for a worthy man, whose own wife might be barren to seek to have children by another man's virtuous and fertile wife with the full consent of her husband. A quirky or fringe tidbit from Plutarch is his assertion that Lycurgus believed this practice would remove jealousy, promote a kind of community of children who belonged more to the state than to individual parents, and ensure that Sparta was always supplied with good stock. This level of pragmatic state-sponsored eugenics, where personal possessiveness in marriage was actively discouraged in favor of producing superior offspring, was profoundly shocking and often incomprehensible to many other Greeks. Another key ancient source, writing much earlier than Plutarch, in the late 5th and early 4th centuries BCE, was the Athenian Xenophon, an exiled general who spent considerable time in Spartan territory and became a great admirer of many aspects of their society. Xenophon, in his Constitution of the Lacedaemonians, also describes and praises Spartan marriage customs. Like Plutarch, he emphasizes their function in promoting physical fitness discipline and the birth of strong children. He too notes the late age of marriage for both sexes, the physical training of girls, and the idea that these practices contributed to the overall health and vigor of the Spartan populace. Xenophon the Athenian looked at Sparta and was clearly quite impressed. Wow. He probably thought these Lacedaemonians are so incredibly disciplined. They barely even see their wives until they're 30. Their food is famously terrible. They share spouses for the good of the state. This is clearly the absolute peak of societal engineering and moral fortitude. Other Athenians one imagines, particularly those who enjoyed a good symposium, a witty philosophical debate, or, actually living with their wife, Zaioi, were probably thinking, Xenophon, my dear fellow, have you considered a nice, relaxing, extended holiday in, say, Mytilene on Lesbos? They have lovely beaches there, excellent wine, and significantly more comfortable dinner party arrangements. Just a thought. The degree to which the often quite detailed accounts of these unique Spartan marriage customs provided by external ancient writers like Plutarch and Xenophon accurately reflect the consistent historical reality of Spartan society across all its periods and social strata, versus presenting a somewhat static, heavily idealized, or even partly propagandistic Lycurgan model designed to serve their own literary or philosophical purposes, is a central and ongoing question in Spartan historiography, requiring critical engagement with their authorial intentions, their potential sources, many of which are now lost to us, and the inherent biases of an outsider observing such a famously insular and often secretive society. These ancient writers, our eyes watching from centuries past, were clearly fascinated and often deeply puzzled by Spartan ways. They saw a society that deliberately flouted many of the norms and values held dear by other Greeks. Their attempts to explain and rationalize Spartan marriage customs, whether attributing them to the singular genius of Lycurgus, to a profound understanding of human nature, or to a ruthless but effective focus on state power, provide us with invaluable, if not always entirely unproblematic insights. They act as our interpreters, struggling as we do to make sense of a path to wedlock that was indeed so very peculiar, so very Spartan. Word count 1399. The voices of Plutarch and Xenophon. Those ancient observers peering with fascination and often a degree of bewildered admiration into the unique world of Spartan customs now begin to fade, Egeria. We have listened to their attempts to explain and rationalize the peculiar path to Spartan wedlock. The ritual capture, the bride's strange transformation, the husband's clandestine visits, and even the community-focused approach to procreation. These writers, separated from classical Sparta by time or cultural outlook, offer us invaluable, if sometimes idealized or filtered windows into a society that deliberately chose to organize its most intimate relationships in ways that often defied the norms of the wider Greek world. Their accounts highlight a Sparta that prioritized the collective over the individual, civic duty over personal sentiment, and the relentless pursuit of strength and discipline above all else. The strange marriage rituals in their eyes were not arbitrary or merely bizarre. They were integral parts of a coherent, if extreme, social system designed by the legendary Lycurgus to forge a nation of peerless warriors and virtuous mothers. Whether we entirely accept their interpretations or view Spartan customs through a more critical modern lens, these ancient eyes provide our most detailed narratives of Phidias, of a society that continues to challenge and intrigue us. As the imagined scrolls of Plutarch and Xenophon are gently rolled up and put away, may you reflect on how different cultures in different times have sought to order the fundamental human experiences of love, marriage, and family. And may you find a quiet appreciation for the enduring human effort to make sense of even the most peculiar of traditions. The ancient commentators Egeria, those keen, if often external, and sometimes rather biased observers like Plutarch and Xenophon, have offered us their fascinating, if occasionally idealized interpretations of Sparta's peculiar path to wedlock. They sought to rationalize these customs, often attributing them to the profound, if somewhat austere wisdom of the legendary lawgiver Lycurgus, framing them as ingenious mechanisms for fostering discipline, eugenic fitness, and unwavering civic virtue. But as you sit with these ancient explanations, Egeria, perhaps you find yourself, like many modern scholars, still pondering the deeper, more complex significances. What was the true aim, the underlying cultural logic behind a ritual as startling and as central to Spartan marriage as that of the marriage by capture? This ritual, the harpage, where the groom, typically at night and with the aid of his close comrades, would symbolically seize his bride by prearrangement, forms the very heart of Sparta's strange approach to matrimony. We've seen how it was not a hostile act of non-consensual abduction in the classical period, but a recognized customary part of the legitimate wedding rites. Yet its performative violence, its secrecy, and its stark contrast to the more public, contractual, and celebratory wedding processions of other Greek cities like Athens demand a closer look. Why did the Spartans, a people so obsessed with order and discipline in almost every other facet of life, choose such a seemingly chaotic and primitive way to initiate their marriages? The Spartans, bless their laconic and often inscrutable hearts, clearly thought the best way to kick off a lifelong commitment and a state-sanctioned procreative partnership was a well-orchestrated theatrical kidnapping in the dead of night. It's certainly one very memorable way to make sure your wedding day isn't easily forgotten. And it also ensured that your new in-laws were either incredibly understanding and fully briefed on the ancient traditions, or just very, very confused about why their future son-in-law didn't simply knock politely on the front door like a civilized person. A mainstream historical fact is that modern scholarship, drawing on comparative anthropology, social theory, and a critical rereading of the ancient sources, interprets the Spartan ritual of marriage by capture not as literal non-consensual abduction during the classical period, but as a complex social drama and a significant rite of passage. It likely held multiple, overlapping symbolic meanings, reflecting core Spartan values and addressing specific societal needs and anxieties. One of the most common interpretations is that the harpage was a symbolic survival of a more archaic practice. Many cultures around the world have or once had traditions of marriage by capture in a more literal sense, especially in earlier, less centralized stages of their social development. It's plausible that the Spartan ritual was a highly stylized, heavily ritualized remnant of such an ancient custom, its original coercive elements now transformed into a symbolic performance, a nod to a wilder, more heroic past, perhaps even pre-Dorian Laconian traditions. Another powerful interpretation views the ritual as a crucial rite of passage for both the bride and the groom. For you, the bride Egeria being captured and taken from your natal home would represent a dramatic, unequivocal severance from your maiden status and your father's household. It was a forceful, if symbolic, transition into your new role as a wife, albeit one initially marked by that peculiar masculinization, cropped hair, man's clothes, and seclusion that we will explore next. For the groom, successfully capturing his bride, even in a prearranged ritual, was a demonstration of his masculine prowess. His daring, his ability to act decisively and with stealth, all highly prized qualities within the Spartan warrior ethos. It was a symbolic conquest, perhaps deemed more appropriate for a Spartiate warrior initiating a marriage than a gentle, persuasive courtship involving flowers and poetry. The ritual could also serve to reinforce Spartan gender roles and societal structures, though in a uniquely Spartan way. The groom's active, assertive role in the capture underscored male dominance and initiative in forming the union. The bride's initial ritualized resistance and subsequent seclusion might symbolize her transition into a new sphere of loyalty. However, as we'll see with her peculiar preparations, this isn't a simple tale of female passivity. The Spartan system had its own strange ways of empowering women within its framework. The precise dominant meaning and original socio-cultural function of the Spartan marriage by capture ritual, whether it primarily served as a symbolic display of male warrior prowess and a reenactment of archaic marital forms, a dramatic rite of passage marking the bride's complete transfer from her natal lineage to her new husband's sphere, even if she didn't immediately join his household. A clever mechanism designed by Lycurgus to manage sexual tensions and ensure eugenic pairings within the rigid confines of the agoge and succession system, or perhaps a complex combination of these and other deeply embedded sociocultural factors, remain subjects of ongoing scholarly debate and diverse theoretical interpretations among classicists and anthropologists. Anthropologists, one imagines, look at this Spartan capture ritual and probably have an absolute field day. Aha! They might exclaim, adjusting their spectacles. A clear example of a liminal phase transition behavior, incorporating elements of ritualized aggression to signify patrilocal residence shift, Or possibly, just possibly, it was just a rather elaborate excuse for young Spartan warriors to practice their nighttime sneaking skills and get out of the communal barracks for an exciting, if somewhat unconventional, evening out. The theories are almost as elaborate and occasionally as peculiar as the ritual itself. The intense secrecy and the illicit feel surrounding the capture and the subsequent clandestine visits also served a specific Spartan purpose, as ancient writers like Plutarch suggested. By making the initial marital encounters difficult, furtive, and almost forbidden, the Spartans believed they were heightening the couple's desire, ensuring their unions were physically vigorous, leading to stronger children, and preventing young husbands from becoming softened by domestic comforts or distracted from their primary military duties and their intense bonds with their male comrades. It was a way of subordinating private life to the demands of the state and the warrior collective. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that some anthropologists have indeed compared the Spartan marriage by capture to similar mock bride theft or ritual abduction customs found in a surprising number of other traditional societies across the globe, both ancient and more recent. This suggests that such rituals in various forms might tap into some very ancient, widespread human patterns of marking marital transitions, negotiating interfamily relations, or perhaps even managing the inherent social tensions and anxieties surrounding the transfer of women between kin groups. Furthermore, the capture element, followed by the bride's unusual preparation, which we will explore next, might have served a psychological toughening function in true Spartan style. It forced both the bride and groom into an unconventional, somewhat stressful, and certainly unromantic initiation into marriage, perhaps seen as building the kind of resilience and stoicism that Sparta valued above all else. It was a clear message marriage, like all other aspects of Spartan life, was not about ease or personal indulgence. It was about duty, discipline, and contributing to the strength of the poli. If you were hoping for a modern rom-com style meet-cute, followed by a whirlwind romance and a fairy tale wedding, ancient Sparta was definitely not the place to be looking. If modern couples tried to emulate Spartan marriage by capture rituals today, it would almost certainly end with a great deal of bewildered 911 calls, several restraining orders, and possibly a rather sensational, if short-lived, reality TV show. Tonight on Spartan Elopement Gone Wild, Leonidas attempts to heroically capture Gorgo from her father's well-guarded suburban villa. But he unfortunately forgets the map, gets tangled in the prize-winning rose bushes, and accidentally abducts her very grumpy and surprisingly agile great-aunt Theodora instead. Hilarious, if somewhat legally questionable, hijinks are sure to ensue. Ultimately, the true aim of this peculiar ritual was likely a complex amalgam of all these factors, a nod to ancient tradition, a rite of passage, a reinforcement of Spartan values, and a pragmatic, if rather extreme, solution to the perceived challenges of integrating marriage with an all-consuming military way of life. It was strange, it was secretive, it was undeniably Spartan. And so Egeria, our sleepy exploration of ancient Sparta's uniquely peculiar path to wedlock, with its ritualized marriage by capture, its bride's startling transformation, and its long years of clandestine barracks to bedroom encounters, draws towards its conclusion. We have delved into the theories behind these strange customs, pondered the motivations of the legendary lawgiver Lycurgus, as described by ancient commentators like Plutarch and Xenophon, and tried to imagine the lived experience of Spartan men and women within this highly regimented, state-focused system. Now, as the mists of Laconia begin to gently swirl and obscure our view of these ancient warriors and their formidable mates, it's time to reflect on the enduring image, the Spartan shadow, that these odd marital arrangements have cast across history, and what legacy, if any, they have left behind. Sparta, they really truly committed to the whole being audaciously different from absolutely everyone else bit, didn't they? It's almost as if at some very early foundational societal meeting, a motion was put forward, all in favor of making every single aspect of our lives, from how we train our children to how we get married, and even how we order our famously unappetizing black broth, as bafflingly peculiar and as starkly minimalist as humanly possible, primarily to confuse and slightly intimidate future historians and sleepy YouTube listeners. Motion overwhelmingly carried, let the rigorous austerity and strange rituals commence. The enduring image of Spartan marriage is one defined by its radical departure from what most other cultures, both ancient and modern, would consider normal or romantic. The lack of overt courtship, the emphasis on eugenic fitness over personal affection or economic alliance, Though these played their subtle parts, the ritualized abduction, the bride's shorn hair and masculine attire, the prolonged separation of spouses with the husband, living in barracks, and even those state-sanctioned arrangements for sharing spouses for procreation. All these elements combine to paint a picture of a society that subordinated individual desires and private life to the perceived needs of the collective to an almost unparalleled degree. This is the core of its peculiar legacy. Throughout history, these customs have provoked a mixture of fascination, admiration from some quarters, particularly those who valued discipline and civic virtue above all else, and outright revulsion or condemnation from those who saw Spartan practices as unnatural, harsh, or repressive. Even their fellow ancient Greeks like the Athenians were often bewildered by Spartan ways, using them as a point of contrast to highlight their own, in their view, more civilized and sophisticated customs. If you were an average Spartan, Ageria trying to patiently explain your unique marriage rituals to a visiting, rather cosmopolitan and worldly Athenian merchant over a shared, if somewhat tense cup of heavily watered wine, the Athenian would probably just nod politely with an increasingly strained smile, while surreptitiously checking for the nearest exit and mentally composing a rather scathing travelogue about the utterly barbaric and emotionally barren nature of Lacedaemonian domestic arrangements. And then, he might later write, they told me the groom pretends to kidnap the bride who has had all her lovely hair chopped off and is dressed like a trainee hoplite. By the gods, these Spartans are a strange and unsettling lot. Pass the perfumed olive oil, someone I need to recover my refined sensibilities. A mainstream historical fact is that the unique social and marital customs of ancient Sparta, while arguably contributing to its renowned military prowess and internal stability for a considerable period, eventually proved to be part of a rigid system that struggled to adapt to changing geopolitical realities and internal demographic pressures. The number of full Spartiate citizens, the warrior elite upon whom the entire state depended, gradually dwindled over the centuries due to constant warfare. Strict citizenship laws, and perhaps even the unintended consequences of their eugenic marriage practices, such as the concentration of land and wealth, making it harder for some to maintain citizen status. This demographic decline was a key factor in Sparta's eventual loss of its dominant position in Greece, after defeats in the 4th century BCE, such as the Battle of Leuctra. The ultimate complex reasons for Sparta's long-term demographic decline and its eventual political irrelevance in the broader Hellenistic and Roman worlds, whether primarily due to inherent flaws and unsustainability within its rigid Lycurgan social system and overly restrictive citizenship laws. The unforeseen negative consequences of its peculiar eugenic marriage and procreative customs. The unsustainable burden of constant warfare and helot suppression, or a multifaceted combination of these internal weaknesses exacerbated by significant external pressures from rising powers, remain a profound and keenly debated question for ancient historians and social scientists. What can we in our sleepy modern contemplation take away from this peculiar Spartan path to wedlock? Perhaps it serves as a powerful if extreme example of how deeply societal values and state interests can shape even the most personal aspects of human life. It's a reminder that our own modern Western ideals of romantic love, as the primary basis for marriage, are themselves a relatively recent historical and cultural construct, not a universal human constant. The Spartans simply had a different set of priorities, a different definition of a successful union. Their marriages were designed to build the state one strong baby at a time. A quirky or fringe tidbit that speaks to the enduring, almost bizarre fascination with Spartan otherness is that even in Roman times, centuries after Sparta's classical power had waned, tourists would still visit Laconia to witness supposed revivals or reenactments of ancient Spartan customs. The diamastagosis, that brutal ritual flogging of boys at the altar of Artemis Orthia, which we touched upon as part of the agoge, actually became a rather bloody and sensationalized tourist attraction, with Roman spectators apparently quite enjoying the spectacle of Spartan youths enduring the lash. This shows how Sparta's reputation for extreme discipline and peculiar rituals continued to capture the imagination, even if the revived customs were perhaps more performative spectacle than authentic tradition by that point. The legacy of Sparta's odd wedlock, then, is not found in widespread imitation. Few societies have ever tried to replicate its unique and demanding system. Rather, its legacy lies in its power to make us reflect on the sheer diversity of human social arrangements, on the different ways cultures have sought to manage procreation, kinship, and social order, and on the often uncomfortable relationship between individual desires and the demands of the collective. So the Spartan marriage system, not exactly a recipe for heartwarming romantic comedies or sentimental greeting cards, but it certainly produced some exceptionally tough cookies. A lot of very interesting historical debates for future generations of sleepy students. And it definitely makes your own family's slightly odd holiday traditions, or your cousin Brenda's three disastrously short-lived marriages seem perfectly reassuringly normal by comparison. The shadow of Mount Taygetus eventually lengthened Egeria and the unique world of Lycurg and Sparta, with its marriage by capture and its state-controlled procreation faded into history, leaving behind a legend of austerity discipline and a path to wedlock so peculiar. It continues to intrigue and perplex us to this very day. The stark, sun-bleached plains of Laconia, Egeria, and the shadowy, torchlit rituals of a Spartan marriage by capture now begin to recede into the gentle quiet of our sleepy historical journey's end. We have walked alongside those formidable Spartan youths, boys and girls alike, through their rigorous upbringing, and witnessed the peculiar state-driven path that led them to a form of wedlock unlike any other in the ancient Greek world. We've pondered the cropped hair of the bride, the clandestine visits of the barracks-bound husband, and the overriding civic duty to produce strong children for the glory and survival of Sparta. This was a society that chose a unique, often harsh, and deeply unconventional approach to life. Love and family, prioritizing the collective good as they perceived it, above all individual sentiment. Their customs, born of a relentless pursuit of military strength and social order, might seem strange, even unsettling to our modern sensibilities, a world away from our own expectations of romance and domesticity. Yet in their own stark way, the Spartans too were grappling with the fundamental human need to create families, to ensure the continuation of their community, and to find meaning and purpose within their rigidly defined world. As the last echoes of laconic Spartan pronouncements and the imagined sounds of their disciplined martial exercises fade into the stillness of your room, may you carry with you a sense of quiet wonder for this most singular of ancient peoples. And may you find your own peaceful rest untroubled by dreams of black broth, ritual abductions, or the demanding gaze of a Spartan ephod.